CD 4.
Dovid wondered how Hartog had formed this opinion. He was, despite himself, impressed by the man's certainty. "By the way, you and Esty must come for dinner tonight. This is no time to be alone. You should be in easy company." Dovid was amused by the phrase, easy company. "I don't think we can," he spoke quickly. "We have a guest." "Oh, well, bring your guest," Hartog smiled. "My wife always makes too much, you know how it is." Dovid spoke slowly. "I don't think it would be appropriate, Dr. Hartog. You see, the guest is a relative of the Rav's." Hartog's eyes brightened. He smiled more broadly. He clasped his hands together. "In that case, you must certainly bring him. It will be an honor." Dovid drew breath to speak, but a smoky yellow thought began to curl at the back of his mind. He said, "All right. I'm sure we'd love to come." As Dovid walked home, the residual pain telegraphing across his skull dissolved into simple bone tiredness. He thought of Esty, who would be cooking, the ticking of the clock becoming louder in her head as the Sabbath approached. He thought of Ronit and of the absurd items in her carrier bags, the running shoes, the drawstring trousers, the mobile telephone and electronic diary. He thought how ridiculous it seemed for them to be together, and, in another way, not ridiculous at all. He remembered how they used to talk and plan. In those years when the three of them were always making some plan, Ronit used to bind them together with words. She would say, "Either we all go or we all stay." She would make them repeat it. There was a fierceness to the words, a certainty. Either we all go or we all stay. And in the end, she had left and accused them of betrayal. In her father's house, sifting and resifting another heap of useless belongings, her dream of that morning already forgotten, although we are told that a dream is 1/60th of a prophecy, Ronit did not yet understand. But Dovid saw she would. And it was evening, and it was morning, the 6th day, and when the sun set, it was Sabbath. I almost missed it completely. Dovid had to come round to my father's house to find me. I was in a happy frenzy of black rubbish bags and orderly piles, slowly progressing across the room. Despite Hinda Rochel's reminder, I had forgotten, as the hours went past, the significance of sunset. At the door, Dovid tapped his watch, smiled, pointed at the sun low on the horizon. "It's time," he said. And I found I knew what he meant, and I didn't resent it in the least. He looked different somehow. I was reminded of that game we used to play as children, where he would pretend that different people were also different colours. I almost had the urge to ask him what colour I was. As we walked home, he told me what he'd done, and I found I didn't resent that either. In fact, it barely surprised me. It seemed like something that had been waiting to be done, something to do with rusted locks and wax-sealed caskets. Home again, jiggity-jog. And here were the Hartogs, just waiting to be startled. I relaxed into the sensation again. This was the person I could be here. The glamorous, unexpected guest, a bewildering presence. I considered the Hartogs as I changed my clothes for Shabbat. I'd never liked them, even when I was quite small. He smelled funny, and she wore real fur coats that made me sneeze. As I grew up and saw what influence they had in the community, that dislike mellowed into full-grown loathing. They're wealthy. That's not a crime, of course, but in the hothouse of humanity that is the northwest London Orthodox Jewish world, money can mean power. It can mean deciding the curriculum of a school or choosing the rabbi of a congregation, supporting one grocery shop by allowing it to undercut another, which goes broke. It can mean giving money only to education programs which, though they don't say it in the glossy brochures, do not allow women to study Gemara. It can mean funding people, like that guy on the street in New York, who hand out leaflets and persuade. All this and more Hartog had done. For Mrs. Hartog, Thruma, I had a particular loathing, not so much institutional as personal. There was a period of my life when I used to spend every Sunday at their house. My father would be judging cases at the Beth Din until the evening. The housekeeper had a day off, and I would go to their house to sit amid their opulence and do my homework. Fruma gave me lunch. She did not make good lunches, that wasn't her thing. Dry bread from the fridge and slices of cheese were about her limit. She wore clickety-click high heels all round the house, even when she was preparing food, and she was always telling me whether or not I looked pretty. Mostly not. What I hated most of all, though, was the way she'd talk about my mother. As, for example, "Ronit, your mother wouldn't have liked you to eat like that," or "Ronit, your mother wouldn't have wanted you to shout so loudly." Even then, I didn't believe what she said, and even then, I didn't feel guilty about it. So, dinner with the Hartogs as an uninvited, unexpected guest, I chose a tight blue skirt with a long slit up one side and felt positively gleeful. Sabbath at SD and Dovid's house came in a welter of tiny forgotten details and sudden dashes to make sure that the hob was turned off or the oven turned on, the urn plugged in, the hot plate properly ordered. I didn't participate. SD and Dovid made it happen around me, reminding me strangely of children playing at being adults while their parents are away. I was oddly charmed by the experience. It had been so long since I'd last seen anyone participate in this peculiar form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Everything must be ready before the Sabbath. Nothing must be left undone. Esty had set up a pair of candles for me to light next to her own. She offered me the matchbox shyly, looking down as she did so, and I thought, what the hell, and lit them. I thought of my mother's silver candlesticks, of the leaves and branches of them, and the shining reflective surfaces. And I did feel it, a little bit. That feeling from long ago, Sabbath peace. We walked to Hartog's house. I remembered which one it was perfectly, large, set well back from the pavement behind a screen of trees on a street of large houses. Everything about it was a little too big. The doors much taller than could be needed to accommodate anyone, the plant urns at each side of the doors oversized, the lion's head door knocker twice the size of a fist. I wondered what Hartog was trying to compensate for, which meant that I still had a smirk on my face when he came to the door, smiling, bustling, because she was still in the kitchen. He was wearing a dark suit with waistcoat, expensively tailored to hide the bulge over his waistband, a dark kipper, not quite concealing the increasing bald spot that was creeping out from under it. He smelled of a little too much very good quality aftershave. Amazingly, he didn't seem to recognize me at first. He looked me hard in the face for a moment, as though he knew he ought to know me, or perhaps to confirm his first awful impression that I was indeed a woman and not some distinguished rabbi. He said, "Good Shabbos, David, Rubitzin Kupperman." Dr. Feingold would probably say it was denial, shielding his mind from unpleasant truths. So I stuck up my hand and said, "Dr. Hartog, maybe you don't remember me. I'm Ronit, the Rav's daughter." As though we'd met at a cocktail party once. My God. I think if I'd gone through it all the whole of the last 32 years, just to experience that moment, it would have been worth it. The man jumped. He literally jumped, as though a charge had passed from my hand to his. I could almost hear a fizzing and popping in the air, could almost smell singed hair. His face turned a strange kind of yellow. He opened and closed his mouth a couple of times, his shaggy eyebrows moving as if they were trying to crawl off his forehead. He said, Ron, Miss Krushka, David didn't, and he stopped. He looked at me. He looked at David, and I swear, there was no sound from the kitchen. But he suddenly said, "Coming, dear," and left us standing on the doorstep. There was a very quiet moment. The three of us wandered into the vast arched space of the entrance hall and stood, our coats still on. We could hear some muffled conversation coming from the kitchen. David was looking guilty as hell. Esty whispered, "Do you think we should go?" And I said, "I think we're just getting started, don't you?" And we were all smiling, these great, wide, shining smiles. We took off our coats, leaving them on one of the velvet-covered benches next to a green marble side table, walked across the hall towards the main lounge, sat down, and waited. The place was just as I remembered it. The room was red, the carpet burgundy, the wallpaper scarlet with a repeated pattern in gold, the curtains dark crimson. I hadn't remembered the opulence, though, on the grandest, least tasteful scale. The huge mirrors on either side of a marble fireplace, decorated with gold curlicues, the vast crystal urns on the mantelpiece and the window-sills, the Versailles-style oil paintings covering almost every spare inch of wall space, all of fruit and flowers, of course, rather than naked women, but nonetheless, the style implied that Mrs. Hartog rather fancied herself a Marie Antoinette. I sat back in one of the patterned velvet armchairs, put my feet up on the coffee table, and waited. Eventually, Hartog and Frumer emerged from the kitchen to join us. Evidently they hadn't run screaming into the night then. Hartog was smiling his "what big teeth I've got" smile, and Frumer had on a smaller, tight-lipped version. She said, "Ronit, how wonderful to see you again. We thought we never would." "Hoped you never would," I thought. I raised an eyebrow. Hartog chimed in, "Yes, it's a real Micaiah to see you, Ronit, and a surprise." They started a duet, each finishing the other's sentence. "Dovid never mentioned you were back in London. No, you never said, Dovid. We haven't heard anything from you, and it's been so long, although, of course, we understand. At a time like this, you'd want to be home with family and old friends, which is good. Yes, it's wonderful, only we didn't know, although, of course, we wouldn't have minded if we had known. But you see, we've got some people coming. We invited them before we knew. We thought Dovid might like to see them, seeing as they knew your father so well. Diane and Rebutsin Goldfarb." Frumer stopped at that, but Hartog's voice was left lonely and small. I almost felt sorry for the man. He said, "And there won't be any trouble, will there?" I said, "Trouble? Hartog, what on earth do you mean?" There was a long pause before Frumer smiled nervously and offered us drinks. Far away, I thought I could scent blood on the air. Or perhaps it was that rusty iron smell of a key turning in an old lock. The anxious waiting was positively delicious. Hartog lapsed into an uncharacteristic silence, while Frumer became ever more twittery and indecisive, roaming restlessly between hall, kitchen, and reception room. When the sound of knocking at the door finally came, they both leapt to answer it. We heard a whispered conversation in the hall, a protest from Hartog, a strangled yelp from Frumer. I muttered to Dovid, "Do you see what's going on here?" He frowned and shook his head. "Succession, Dovid, succession." Esty and Dovid exchanged a glance. Dovid said, "We don't think so. We talked about it this morning. I'm not eminent enough." I rolled my eyes. "Look at what's happening here. Do you think it's a coincidence you were invited with the Goldfarbs?" Dovid looked blank. "Diane Goldfarb was a good friend of your father. He supported the shul." I sighed. "Dovid, Diane Goldfarb is one of the most influential rabbis in Britain, and that's the reason he's here tonight. If Hartog wants you to become Rav, Diane Goldfarb would be a perfect person to support you. With him behind you, the transfer of power would be smooth. No one would argue with the Diane's backing. Just you wait and see. By the end of the evening, Hartog will have impressed on him what a learned young man you are, how you've been too modest to step forward until now, what trust the community puts in you." Dovid blinked. The door swung open, and the Goldfarbs entered the room. I was right, naturally. Over dinner, Hartog attempted on several occasions to swing the conversation round to Dovid's achievements and merits. But of course, Diane and Rebitsin Goldfarb were far more interested in hearing about what I'd been up to for the past few years. It wasn't anyone's fault, really. It was only to be expected. The Goldfarbs hadn't seen me for 7 or 8 years, weren't the kind of people to listen to malicious gossip, really were genuinely interested to find out about me. to listen to my little stories of New York life. Fruma served her 5 courses with increasing irritation. They'd evidently had someone in to cook for them. The food was much too good for Fruma's mean-spirited catering. The gefilte fish arrived, each creamy disk crowned with a circle of carrot, as Diane Goldfarb asked my opinion of Stern College, where I'd taken my undergraduate degree. The gefilte fish plates departed, and the golden chicken soup arrived. We spoke about work prospects in the city. The Goldfarbs had a nephew working in the financial district. The soup bowls were gathered, and 2 roast chickens were presented, dripping clear fat onto the roast potatoes beneath, accompanied by their vegetable entourage. Rubitzin Goldfarb named and assessed her 8 children and 37 grandchildren now living in London, Manchester, Leeds, Gateshead, New York, Chicago, Toronto, Jerusalem, Bernay-Brac, Antwerp, Strasbourg, and 2, she gasped, in Melbourne. Imagine! The plates were cleared and the desserts placed in the centre. Orange cake with oranges in thick, alcoholic syrup in the centre, circular meringues topped with strawberries. Hartog tried in vain to talk about Dovid's future. The Goldfarbs asked about my career prospects. We ate the cake. Rubitzin Goldfarb took tiny bites and made appreciative noises. She said, "This is wonderful, Fruma, wonderful. You must give me the recipe." Fruma's mouth dropped. "Yes," she said. "Yes, but not on Shabbos, of course." She was sallow. I smirked. I wanted to lean over and whisper, "You didn't make this at all, did you, Fruma?" But Rubetzin Goldfarb was already posing another question, so sweetly it felt impossible not to respond. She said, "So, Ronit, any young men in your life?" She asked with that tender smile on her face, the one that older people always use when they want to let you know it's time to get married. Now, here's the thing. I wanted to tell her what she wanted to hear. I really did. At that moment, after such a pleasant evening's conversation, I wanted to be able to say, "Oh, yes, a doctor. Is he Jewish? Why, certainly. We're getting married next year. We'll live in Manhattan." I could see how delightfully the conversation would proceed from that point, how we'd talk about wedding plans and about the future. I found myself longing for that conversation with all my heart. I wanted to say that, and I saw myself wanting it, and I hated the part of me that wanted that to be true. I heard a screaming creak from far away, and I found myself thinking of a lock and an old rusted key resting heavy in my palm. This is all the explanation I can offer because, honestly, which of us really understands why we do the things we do? I said, "Actually, Rubitzin Goldfarb, I'm a lesbian. I live with my partner in New York. Her name is Miriam. She's an architect." It's not true. It's never been true. There was a Miriam a long time ago, but we never lived together. And the architect was another woman entirely. And let's face it, currently, I'm sleeping with a married man, so I could have said that and shocked them just as much. Or maybe not. I looked at Fruma. Her skin had a greyish cast. She was staring not at me but at the Goldfarbs, unblinking and terrified. Onwards, I thought. Onwards and through is the only way. Yes, we're having a commitment ceremony next year, and then we're talking about kids, maybe a sperm bank, but a gay couple we know say they might want to be fathers, but you know how it is. I leaned forward, conspiratorial. I noticed that no one else leaned with me. They say they want children, but they still want to be out every night. Still, 4 incomes better than 2, and it'd save a lot of paperwork. I smiled, as though I were telling an amusing anecdote at a friend's party. After all, the turkey baster only gets used at Thanksgiving anyway, right? I folded my hands in my lap and sat back to survey the damage. The Hartogs were the best. Very satisfying to observe. Her mouth was hanging open, and she was looking from Diane Goldfarb to Rubitzin and back, glassily fish-eyed. He was staring down at the table, fingers at his temples, shaking his head slowly from side to side. Dovid was smiling. He was looking up at the ceiling with his hand half covering his mouth, silently smirking. Sitting next to me, Esty looked as if she might start crying, which made me want to shout at her, because for God's sake, did she expect me not to say what she already knew? Or did she expect to have been the only one for me, that I should have been as paralysed as she's obviously been all these years? And the Goldfarbs. I should have known. I could have known, but I didn't think of how they'd feel. Or maybe I did, but I didn't care. Just a moment before, I did care very much. Diane Goldfarb was looking at his hands, quiet, impassive. His lips were moving, but there was no sound. And the Rebbitzin, she wasn't looking away or trying to gauge someone else's reaction. She was just looking at me, full of sadness. I thought I'd come to all sorts of decisions about what I believe, that it is better for things to be said than remain unsaid, that I have nothing to be ashamed about, that those who live narrow lives have only themselves to blame when they find themselves shocked. As it turns out, I don't seem to have got what Scott would call total buy-in from all levels of my brain on those principles. I thought I should phone Dr. Feingold, just to let her know that nothing had been resolved, even after all this time. Because I did feel it. Shame. They're not bad people. None of them are. Well, maybe the Hartogs, but the Goldfarbs aren't bad people. They're not cruel or unpleasant or malicious. They didn't deserve to have their peaceful Friday night dinner overturned. They didn't deserve me smashing my life straight into theirs. It can't have been right that I did. And if I hadn't, yeah, that wouldn't have been right either. Chapter 6. God instructed the moon to make itself new each month. It is a crown of splendour for those who are born from the womb, because they are also destined to be renewed like her. From the Kiddush Levana, recited every month after the third day of the lunar cycle and before the full moon. What is the shape of time? On occasion, we may feel that time is circular. The seasons approach and retreat the same every year. Night follows day, follows night, follows day. The festivals arrive in their time, cycling one after the other, and each month the womb and the moon together grow fat and fertile, then bleed away and begin to grow once more. It may seem that time leads us on a circling path, returning us to where we began. In other moods, we may view time as a straight and infinite line, dizzying in its endlessness. We travel from birth to death, from past to future, and each second which ticks by is gone forever. We talk of managing time, but time manages us, hurrying us along where we might have wished to linger. We can no more halt time than the moon can halt her nightly journey across the sky. As is so often the case, these two seemingly irreconcilable observations combine to form the truth. Time is spiral. Our journey through time may be compared to an ascent around the outside of a round tower. We travel, it is true, and can never return to the places we have left. However, as each revolution brings us higher and further, it also brings us round to encounter the same vistas we have seen before. Every Shabbat is different to the Shabbat before. Nonetheless, every Shabbat is Shabbat. Each day brings evening and morning, yet no day will ever be repeated. The moon, waxing and waning in accordance with the wishes of her Creator, is our example, always changing, always the same. We should remember this. Often it may seem that time has taken us very far from our origin, but if we take only a few more steps, we will round the corner and see a familiar place. And sometimes it may seem that in all our travelling we have returned to the place where we began. But although the view may be similar, it will never be identical. We should remember that there is no return. Esty closed her eyes. Her breaths were soft and regular. She listened to the sounds of the synagogue around her. A low murmur of chatter, of pages being turned and children quieted, buzzed in the ladies' gallery. Below, in the men's section, a man was reading the Torah portion at an unhurried pace, speaking each word with its proper intonation and note. David had shown her how each word in the Torah is written with ta'omim, small dots and lines, which indicate whether its note should ascend or descend, which syllable should be stressed. The symbols, he had said, allow the reader to bring an individuality to his reading while ensuring a uniformity of tone. Because of this, a Torah reading is always the same, but always different. This reader's voice was rich and fluid. She allowed her mind to catch on one or two of the Hebrew words as they passed by, translating them, savouring them, and then releasing them. The subdued activity murmured on around her. Somewhere nearby in the ladies' gallery, someone was whispering. A child was speaking a little too loudly. A door was opened and allowed to swing shut. Let it go. Let it all go. Esty spread her mind wider and wider around the synagogue until she inhabited every space of it in her slow breathing. She was in the puckered ceiling plaster and the tired blue carpet, in the grills that covered the windows, in the red plastic of the chairs, in the electric wires within the walls, and in the throat pulse of every man and woman. She breathed and felt the synagogue inhale and exhale with her. Dwelling within the congregation, she noted the familiar soup of thought and emotion. There were angers here, bitter hatreds, fear and boredom, and resentment and guilt and sorrow. She saw herself from outside herself. Am I really? She thought. Can that be me? That person who appears so strange to all these others? She saw herself through a dozen pairs of eyes, each one registering her oddness with fear or disgust or confusion. She smiled at the people as she passed through them, saying, "Oh, yes, you think I'm strange, but I know something you don't know." She swept herself around the synagogue in a lazy arc, from the men's section below, up slowly into the ladies' gallery, which is always, doubtless, reserved for ladies and not for women. She moved around the rims of the gallery, resting near the corners of the ceiling, where the 3 rows of chairs jostled together, and the net curtain bunched and gathered, screening them from view. She investigated slowly. She knew what she was looking for. She allowed herself time to find it, among the sincere prayer and the insincere, among the worries and regrets and dedication and boredom and confusion and disapproval of the women. She imagined that she was surprised. Why, what is this? A new thought, a new mind? So unexpected. Who on earth could it be? She took her time answering. She let the question hang, enjoying the suspense. She smiled. To herself, only to herself. "It is Ronit," she said. "I am sitting next to Ronit, and her warm body is beside me as it always used to be. Time, which is a circle, which will always return us to our starting points, has returned her to me." Esty thought, "I am happy. This is happiness. I have remembered it." When she was 12 or 13, young but no longer a child, Esty once heard a snatch of conversation pass between 2 women standing outside the synagogue. She was good at remaining unobserved. People often failed to notice her, allowing her to hear things that were not meant for her. Her own parents sometimes passed her by in the synagogue hall, even while attempting to look for her. Esty considered this ability a gift. "Did you see the Rav's daughter in shul today?" one of the women said. The second woman nodded. The first raised her eyebrows and inhaled loudly. "I didn't know where to look. Do you think the Rav knows she behaves like that?" The second woman, older and kinder, said, "She'll settle down. She's only young and living in that motherless house, poor thing." Esty would have heard more, but Ronit bounded over, and it became impossible to remain unnoticed. The 2 women swiftly began to discuss a forthcoming wedding. For a while, Esty wondered whether to tell Ronit to behave better or differently. She wondered if Ronit would even know what the women had meant. Esty knew. She had an acute sense always of rectitude. She tried to imagine how Ronit might react to such a conversation, and found it impossible. In her mind, she couldn't even get beyond the first line of discussion. She had already begun to love her. Not as she would do later, but in a fashion which made this conversation, the possibility of breach and separateness, impossible. Loving Ronit seemed already to demand some denial of herself, or perhaps, she reflected later, all love demands that. In any case, she could not tell Ronit what she had heard. They continued as they had before. Sometimes they would hang over the rail of the ladies' gallery together, desperate and comic, trying to attract Dovid's attention. They would wait until he turned in roughly their direction, and Ronit would start to wave or puff out her cheeks or stick out her tongue. Esty, laughing and embarrassed, would hold back and then join in, so that Ronit wouldn't tug her arm or make a mocking face. And Dovid, who was 16 or 17, would usually try to ignore them. His eyes would flick up to catch the unexpected motion, and when he saw the two gurning girls, flick down again. Generally his face would be grave, his eyes fixed on his prayer book. But sometimes he smiled, and sometimes he would look back up at them, and making sure he could not be observed, he would stick his tongue out too. Those were the best moments, the ones they waited for, the ones for which Esty was willing to bear the risk that her mother would look up at the wrong moment and notice her behaviour. Once or twice, Esty's mother noticed and, after synagogue, spoke to her quietly about behaviour appropriate to a girl, about the quiet calm that she expected from her. At these times, Esty would listen and nod, but in her heart she knew she would disobey again. Esty and Ronit would do other things too. Before they were 12, when they were still permitted to enter the men's section, Ronit once persuaded Esty to help her tie the ends of all the tallits together in one long row, so that they became confused and tangled when the men stood up for prayer. Ronit would pull Esty out during boring bits of the service to take part in complicated running, jumping, hopping, skipping games she used to invent in the corridor outside the main synagogue. They grew to have the reputation of naughty girls, a matter which would occasionally cause Esty's parents some concern, some tutting and sighing. Ronit used to say, "We have to do something. Shul's so boring." She would roll her eyes. Esty was always both shocked and impressed when Ronit spoke like this. A part of her wanted to remind Ronit of what they'd learnt together in school about God and prayer, about having the proper respect for synagogue, and how wrong, how very wrong it was to call it boring. But she found the words dried up and choked her before she could utter them. She wondered sometimes how Ronit grew all these ideas, if perhaps they sprouted in the darkness of her head like mushrooms, fostered by the motherless atmosphere, as certain plants need greenhouses and special soils. She wondered if she placed her head very close to Ronit's, some of the spores of them might travel into her. She imagined Ronit's thoughts, light and downy, coming to rest in her brain, sending out first one exploratory route, then another, sinking themselves deep down into the spongy tissue, becoming matted and brain-logged. She would not know at first, as they grew, until the new thoughts began mushroom-popping inside her skull, and she would find herself, without warning, different. She would belong to Ronit. Their ideas would be one. She did not know whether this idea pleased or frightened her. Esty was surprised, sitting next to Ronit in the synagogue, to find that the place was still the same. She had thought somehow over these years that the building itself, the fixtures and fittings, must have become different. But now, with Ronit here, she could see that was not the case. The place was just the same as it had been 20 years before, so that Esty was almost surprised to find that Ronit was not leaping, running, making faces. She was behaving with perfect propriety, hands folded, following the reading in the Chumash before her. Esty found that she could not behave so correctly. She missed the page, dropped her book, and had to pick it up from the floor and kiss it. She found herself still standing when everyone around her had already sat down. She could not concentrate. She was waiting for something. She knew what was coming. She had realized it the previous day with finger-prickling delight. She thought perhaps Ronit might remember what the reading would be today, but had decided not. Esti did not remind her, did not say, "Do you know what day it is tomorrow?" She held the knowledge inside herself and waited for the moment. The Torah portion was over. The measured intonations ended. Now there was only the Haftarah to be read, an extract from the writings of the prophets. A soft paper rustling susurrus whispered in the shul as the congregation turned the pages of their books. The men shuffled. One left the bima, returned to his seat at the other side of the synagogue. His neighbours shook his hand. Hartog looked up and around, gimlet-eyed. "Tomorrow," he announced, "as we all know, is Rosh Chodesh Keshavan, the first day of the month of Keshavan. So, instead of our usual Haftarah, we will be reading the section of Rosh Chodesh Eve." He announced the page number in the various editions of the Chumash. Esti's smile reached all the way from her inside to her outside. She felt it tug at the corners of her lips. She promised herself she would not look at Ronit until the reading began, until they had gone, say, 10 lines. She waited. She wondered if Ronit was waiting too, if she'd known all along. The reader began. A similar pattern of intonation, but not identical, to differentiate the words of the prophets from the words of Torah. The tones of the Haftarah, more melodic and more poignant than those of the Torah reading, speak so often of faithfulness and betrayal, of Israel's failures of love towards God. But not today. Esti followed the English with her eyes. Jonathan said to him, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty." That wasn't the best part. Esti's eyes skipped ahead, flicking through the familiar story. Jonathan was the son of King Saul. David was Jonathan's closest friend and King Saul's favourite musician. King Saul was angry with David, but David had to be sure whether he really meant to harm him. So together, Jonathan and David made a plan. David would hide in the countryside nearby. He would miss the feast to celebrate the start of the new month. Jonathan would wait to see what Saul did. If all was well, he would send word that David could return. But when Saul saw that David was missing, he was enraged. Jonathan tried to calm his father, but Saul knew that he was trying to protect David. His anger flared, and he said, "Do you think I don't know that you have chosen this David, son of Jesse, to your shame and the shame of your mother's nakedness?" The Haftarah reader was talented. Through the sing-song notes, he managed to produce King Saul's rough, anguished voice. Now, she'd waited long enough. She touched Ronit very lightly on the arm. "Do you remember?" she whispered. Ronit looked at her and blinked. "Sorry?" "It's Makar Chodesh. Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. Do you remember what you told me once about this day?" Ronit frowned. Esti waited. The cadences of the reader's voice were low and melodious, recounting David and Jonathan's meeting in the fields outside the city, telling of a love which the rabbis record was the greatest which has ever been known. The notes fluttered up and down the scales, falling like tears and rising like an arrow sprung from the bow. "Makar Kodesh, when we read about David and Jonathan," she whispered. Ronit's face cleared. "Oh, right. Yes. Yes, it's today." Esti smiled. She turned back to her book. "It's today," she thought. "It's today." The reader came to the end of the portion. Jonathan went to David's hiding place and told him to run away, for King Saul meant to kill him. And the men kissed each other and wept with one another until David exceeded. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace. What we two have sworn in the name of God shall be forever." At the end of the Sabbath, after they'd eaten, after Ronit had gone to and returned from her father's house, after the Sabbath detritus had been cleared away, David set off for Manchester. He had been intending to go. He wanted to see his mother, to comfort her in the loss of her brother. It had all been arranged. The car was ready. He took Estie's hand, kissed her cheek, and he was gone. Esty and Ronit stood in the empty hallway. Ronit shuffled awkwardly. She said, "I think I'll—" and Esty said, "Let's go out. Let's go for a walk, a coffee." She said it so boldly there was nothing for Ronit to say but yes. Waiting for Ronit to change her clothes, Esty stepped out into the unkempt front garden. She looked up. The sky was blue and black and purple, uncertain as the skin of an aubergine. The moon was absent, a circle of darkness denoting the possibility of presence, the inevitability of return. "Tomorrow is the new moon," she said to herself. "Tomorrow the moon will return, as Ronit has returned to me." Esty breathed the night air, waiting. They walked, side by side, along the quiet suburban streets, through one of the large open parks of Hendon, heading towards Brent Street and Golders Green Road. The path was heavily overgrown, with gangly tree arms sweeping this way and that from overhead. Although the evening was warm, a gusty breeze blew a few dry leaves across the pathways and the tarmac playground with a skittering sound. The place was utterly deserted. Hendon rested contented and perhaps a little overfull from the Sabbath. Hendon might walk out later to buy bagels or for a cinema outing, but for now was satisfied to remain at home. Esty took Ronit's arm as they walked. Ronit looked at Esty's arm, interlinked with her own, but did not try to move away. "Do you remember?" Esty said. "We used to come here after school. Over there." She stretched her right arm across the dark expanse. "At the swings. Do you remember? We used to come here after school sometimes on Fridays in the winter, when they let us out early. It was a special place." Ronit peered out into the darkness to the right of them. The movement brought her closer to Esty, pushing her into Esty's arm and side. She made a moo with her lips, a puzzlement. "Was that here?" she said. "I can't see. Wasn't it nearer to the station? I think I remember some swings near the station." Esty smiled. "That was later, when we were older. Those were the swings we used to go to in the evenings, when we told our parents we were studying at each other's houses. You remember?" There was a pause. They walked on, more slowly now than they had been. "Oh, yes," said Ronit. "I'd forgotten that." "You do remember everything." "Yes," thought Esty. "Everything." She looked up at the stars. They were brighter here, away from the streetlights. The sky was almost cloudless, with only one long streak of thin clouds smudged across the blue-black. Beneath the heavens, she thought, this is where we are, always, but especially here, with the heavens looking. She spoke to the stars silently. She said, "Can you still love me after what I have done?" The stars were quiet, but they continued to shine. She took this as a positive indication. She said, "Your sister is gone." The stars thought for a moment. They said, "Our sister will return." Esty said, "As mine has." The stars winked and smiled. Ronit said, Esty, what are you muttering about?" Esty said, "Let's walk through the trees." She pulled on Ronit's arm, directing her gently towards the clump of trees by the side of the path. They stopped in the midst of the trees, where the leaves and branches obscured the heavens just a little. Ronit said, "I don't think this is the way. Shouldn't we be going up the hill?" Esty tugged on Ronit's arm. Ronit said, "Esty, are you all right?" "Yes," Esty wanted to say. "I am better than I have known myself to be." She did not speak for a moment. She took comfort from the stars and the whispering arms of the trees. A thought occurred to her. She said, "Do you think that you are the stars, perhaps, and that I am the moon? I thought you were the moon, but I've been absent too, you know. I think I've been absent all this time." Ronit looked at her. In the silence, a night bird called to others of its kind. Beneath the trees, under the heavens, Esty passed a hand across her face, tucking a strand of hair into the scarf wrapped respectably around her head. She wondered if she should have explained herself more clearly. She could not explain herself at all. There were no words, no permitted words to explain anything that she wanted to say. All the words that could have communicated it had been banned, not only from her mouth, but even from her mind. She was reduced to mere actions, which are both more and less than words. Ronit took a step backwards and said, "I really think it's up that way, Esty." This was the time. If she were to do it, it would have to be done now. "No," she said. "No, come here." Ronit's eyes were very wide. "Esty," she said, "you're behaving like a serial killer. Let's go and get a coffee, for goodness sake." Esty saw that she had begun this incorrectly, that she should have chosen other words, perhaps another place. It was too late now for such decisions. She looked up through the branches of the tree, at the empty moon and the iron sky. She pulled on Ronit's hand, smiling, and saw Ronit shake a little. She knew then that Ronit felt it too. She pulled Ronit towards her. Ronit resisted a little, and then surrendered. They were standing very close together, under the arms of the tree. She could smell the milky scent of Ronit's American washing powder and the slight tang of her sweat. Ronit said, "Really, Esty, this is freaking me out." Esty said, "Shh," leaned forward, raised herself on the balls of her feet, and placed her lips very softly against those of her love. Fuck. Just when everything was going so well. Fuck, I should have seen it coming. Really, I should have seen it from the way she looked at me at the Hartogs, or maybe earlier than that. Maybe when I knew she'd got married to David, or when she seemed so nervous to see me. Perhaps I did see it coming in a way. In synagogue, she was so strange, going on about David and Jonathan as if they were in some way significant, as if they were more than a story in a book. And then at home, for lunch, when she asked about Miriam, my imaginary architect lover, with the strangest look on her face. Happiness and envy and disgust and disappointment and longing, all mingled together. Or, being honest, maybe I'm making that up in retrospect. In any case, what I did then that perhaps with hindsight I shouldn't have done was to admit that there was no Miriam. That for all the Hartog shock and the Goldfarb's attempts at sensitivity the night before, I'd just made her up. David laughed. I was surprised. He laughed and said, "So, are you single then?" And I said, "Yes." Because I didn't want to say yes, although I've been seeing a married man who broke up with me a few weeks ago because he felt guilty about deceiving his wife, but we did sleep together last week, although only because I was feeling low. Honesty has its limits, after all. And David said, "You invented Miriam to irritate the Hartogs." Excellent. And I laughed, and David laughed, and Esty sort of looked at me. That's all she did. She looked at me, and I started to get an uncomfortable, prickly feeling somewhere in the back of my mind about that look, and the past and the future, so much so that after lunch I decided to walk off back to my father's house, to look for the candlesticks again, although I didn't tell them that. I was starting to get the sneaking suspicion that my father would have thrown them away rather than leave them for me to find. I said, "Oh, there's all this stuff to be sorted out, better get on." Remembering, of course, that sorting out of any description is another thing that's forbidden on the Sabbath day, not to mention turning on the radio and dancing in the hallway to Shania Twain. But somehow I couldn't get out of the house fast enough. Somehow even the oppressiveness of my father's house, even the rows of disapproving books, seemed preferable to staying with Esty and David. So, yeah, I guess in a way I must have known. Fuck. But in another way, I couldn't have known at all. Being here forbids it. It's this place that's the problem. It's being back here with all those little couples sitting in their identical houses, producing identical children. It was seeing them in synagogue. All those women in their smart Shabbat suits and their perfectly matched hats, and each woman appropriately paired to a man, preferably with a child tugging at each arm. They just fit together, the whole set, like Orthodox Jew Barbie. Comes complete with Orthodox Ken. 2 small children, the house, the car, and a selection of kosher foodstuffs. They make you believe it, until it seems obvious that people come in matched pairs and you don't think to look underneath, and you give up wondering because it all seems just so neat. And I wanted to believe it too. That's the thing. In a part of my brain, I really wanted to believe that even girls you used to sleep with can end up having the happily married Hendon dream as long as they just close their eyes and wish hard enough. I didn't think I still had that bit to my brain, thought I'd managed to excise it with my therapy and anger. But no, there it was. I was convincing myself more and more strongly that everything was perfectly normal here, and that Esty was probably completely happy right up until the moment when she kissed me. I'd forgotten how fragile she is. For the first moment, that was all I could think, that she was leaning into me, resting on my arms and chest, and she was so light I could hardly feel her. And I'd forgotten her smell, little changed in all these years. She always smelled clean, something like lavender and soap and maybe violets. I'd forgotten how it had been between us, but I could see she hadn't forgotten. For just a moment she made me remember it too, for just that little piece of time, standing in a field in Hendon in the middle of the night, underneath the stars in the moonless sky. I remembered the taste of her. It was like a connection, a completed circuit linking the past to the present, suddenly, unexpectedly, and for that instant I knew where I was, but not when. I pushed her gently away and said, "No." She looked puzzled. She moved away and then moved towards me again. I said more firmly, "No." She took a pace back. Her face half disappeared in shadow. The trees around us buzzed and hummed. She said, "Do you not? With girls? Have you given up? Did you stop?" How strange that this should be the first thing to cross her mind, as though that was the only thing she could think of. There was a sort of fearful hope in her eyes, like she wanted to be taught how to quit.
"No, I haven't given up. And you're not seeing anyone?"
I wanted to laugh at that. I wanted to nudge her in the ribs and say, "No, I'm not seeing anyone, but that doesn't mean I want to see you, because it's been over for a long time, Esty. It's old. It was old a long time ago, wasn't it?" I wanted to say, "Esty, would you serve an old dish of food to a guest? You'd have to be pretty hungry to eat old food, wouldn't you?"
"No. Look, it's just..."
I passed a hand across my forehead.
It wasn't just anything. It was 100 things, 1,000. It's just that you're married, Esty.
I heard her sigh in the darkness. She shifted her shoulders a little and moved towards me. She found my hand with hers and lifted it up, as if to inspect it, although it was too dark for that. With the tip of her finger, she traced a line across my palm. After a few seconds, she spoke slowly. "Yes, I'm married. But that is a thing between me and David. Do you see? And whatever harm you might do to it has been done already. There is nothing more. And whatever pain I may give him, I have caused already. I know that. And whatever God may think of me, he thinks already." Another long pause. The wind died down to nothing. Above us, an aeroplane blinked across the night, an artificial star in an empty sky. She said, "Sometimes I think that God is punishing me for what we did together. Sometimes I think that my life is a punishment for wanting, and the wanting is a punishment too. But I think if God wishes to punish me, so be it. That is his right. But it is my right to disobey." She sounded more certain than Scott had ever been. I'll give her credit for that. She said, "I've been waiting for you all this time. I knew you couldn't stay, not then. But now, with your father gone, with everything that's happened, now you can stay, can't you? Now we can be together like we always were." This seemed impossible. Did she really?
Could she really think that I'd been longing to come back to Hendon all this time, that I'd only been prevented because of some argument with my father? I took her arm and pulled her towards the path, where the sodium-orange street lamps gave a little light. I said, "Esty, what is it that you see happening here? I live in New York. I'm going back there in 3 weeks. I'm just here to sort out my father's stuff. This is not... Look, this was over a long time ago, you and me. It was a long time ago." Esty smiled again, and to be honest, she was really starting to creep me out on so many levels, which made me think about how she never used to be like this. I mean, she was always quiet and a bit strange, but never like this. Which just goes to prove what I've always suspected, that living in Hendon will eventually send you mad. And I was just considering whether there might be some kind of gaseous emanation from underground mineral deposits to account for it, which I suppose demonstrates that I wasn't all there myself, when she bloody well kissed me again. I pushed her off me and held her at arm's length. I'm stronger than she is, always have been. Wasn't too difficult. I said, "No. Look, Esty, you have to stop that. This is not, just stop that, okay?" She frowned and twisted awkwardly out of my grasp. She stood, feet apart, looking at me. I said more calmly, "It was a long time ago, Esty. I know we used to, but I don't want to anymore." There was another long pause. I looked out across the park, but it was too dark to see anything except the moving shapes of trees on the rise of the hill, stirring in the wind. Esty spoke, and her voice was a little nearer to my left ear than I would really have liked. She said, "But you were the only person." She broke off. I turned my head and saw that she was crying. Silent, streaming tears shining on her face like a medieval portrait of the Virgin Mary. What could I do? She didn't need me right now. She needed a whole bunch of friends who'd take her out for margaritas and tell her that I was a bitch. She needed my life in New York, just like I'd needed hers in Hendon, the night my father died. There's no solution to these things. I took her hand and said, "Look, it's going to be okay." This was a lie, of course. I think I was planning to follow it up with something like "plenty more fish in the sea," or "you'll get over it," something pithy like that. But I didn't get the chance. Oh, infinite joy of being in Hendon, out of the darkness spake a voice, and the voice said, "Esty, run it, shove it off. Did you have a good Shabbos?" We turned to look. It was good old Hinder Rochelle Burditcher, in wig, smart brown suit, and matching court shoes, on the arm of a tall, bearded man. Hinder Rochelle was beaming. "This is my husband, Lev," she said. "Lev, this is Ronit, the Rav's daughter, you remember? I told you about her." I'll bet she did. Lev nodded at me gravely and said, "I'm sorry for your loss. I wish you a long life." I thanked him, all the time thinking how much did they see, walking through the darkness towards us, standing under a street lamp. Not that it had damaged my life, but Esty's, well, it couldn't be good. We exchanged a few words. It seemed impossible to get rid of them. Hinder Rochelle was so delighted to see us. Did we want to come back with them for a drink? No. Maybe we'd be free a bit later, or tomorrow, with David. Oh, he was in Manchester, was he? Hinder Rochelle and Lev exchanged a look. Maybe the following Shabbat? We'd give them a call, yes, we would. We promised. Or rather, I promised. Esty was positively monosyllabic. And where were we going now? For a coffee? Well, they really shouldn't keep us. Another look passed between them. They smiled. They moved off out of the pool of light, leaving Esty and me standing underneath the street lamp again, in silence. I said, "Esty, let's just forget this happened, okay? It's the walk, the moonlight, or, lack of moonlight. It's nothing. Let's have our coffee now." But it was too late to salvage. She backed away from me, at first slowly, and then, turning, started to run. She stumbled up the hill back towards her house. I wondered if I should go after her. She might be in danger on her own. On the other hand, Hendon wasn't New York, and this wasn't Central Park. She'd probably be all right. I turned away and walked up towards Golders Green. Dr. Feingold would say that you can only free yourself, that we are all masters of our own destinies, and the only person who can help you is you. She'd lean back in her white chair in front of her white walls and say, "Ronit, what makes you think that you can solve this situation? What makes that your responsibility?" And on one level, she's right. You can't solve anyone else's life for them, but then if you see someone struggling with a heavy load, isn't it forbidden to walk on without helping them? I thought again about Esther's life, and I thought about what it is that I know, which isn't much, but might be something. I thought about God. I hadn't thought about him for quite a while, but I remembered his voice then. I thought about how, whatever you do, once you've heard it, it continues to mutter in your ear with its inexplicable certainties and unacceptable justifications. I marched through Golders Green, passing by the rows of Jewish stores. The little world my people have built here. The kosher butcher shops frowned at me, asking why I hadn't tried their chopped liver, now only £2.25 a quarter. The recruitment agency smiled widely, inviting me to apply for a job with a Sabbath-observant company, half-day Fridays in the winter. Moishe's salon raised an eyebrow at my hairstyle and wondered if I wouldn't like something maybe a bit more like everyone else. I thought about how God, belief in God, in this God, has done violence to these people, has warped them and bent them, so they can't even acknowledge any longer that they have desires, let alone learn how to act on them. I walked on, down Golders Green Road, past the bagel shops where crowds of teenagers were shouting and laughing, past the grocery stores and the little kosher cafes, which we used to visit so often we knew the menus off by heart. Not much was still open. But as I came to Golders Green Station, I saw a little patisserie that wouldn't be closing for a while. It wasn't kosher. It was mostly empty. I wondered if Esty had ever noticed that it was here, a piece of another life, 20 minutes' walk from her house. I sat down and ordered a large slice of chocolate cake from a tired-looking waitress. When it came, I thought of all the non-kosher things that could be in it. Gelatine holding the filling together, made of boiled pig bones, colourings made from dead insects, beef lard to grease the cake tin, shellfish extracts added to the flour to make it softer. I saw the plate full of dead, decaying, unclean things. Things that the rabbis tell us will harden our hearts and make us less able to hear the voice of God. I took a bite. The cake was dry, the filling greasy. I ate it anyway, bite after bite.
This is the end of CD 4. The book continues on CD 5. CD 5.
Chapter 7. The sages said, "Anyone who converses excessively with a woman causes evil to himself, neglects Torah study, and will eventually inherit Gehinnom." Pirkei Avot 1:5, studied on Sabbath afternoons between Passover and New Year. Our sages warn us often against the perils of gossip, lashon hara, which means literally an evil tongue. Certainly it is forbidden to spread false tales. Is this not bearing false witness, an action forbidden in the 10 utterances from Mount Sinai? And as it is forbidden to speak false tales, so is it forbidden to listen to them. For he who speaks and he who listens both sin against the name of the Lord. And further, it is forbidden to tell or to listen to any stories, even if they are true, which might cause us to regard a person less favourably. In fact, it is generally held preferable to avoid speaking of others at all, even to spread good news. Despite this, the temptations of lashon hara are difficult to resist. The Torah tells us that, in the time when God's presence was not so hidden from the world, Tzarat,
a virulent leprosy was visited upon those who spoke Lashon Hara. No place was too high to be visited by Tzara'at. When Miriam, the sister of Moses, spoke ill of his wife, she was afflicted with a disease. It is written that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, for which we mourn with unceasing bitterness, was caused by the continual Lashon Hara of the people of Israel. Lashon Hara is the most tempting of forbidden acts, easy, enjoyable, plentiful in supply. Yet we are enjoined to refrain from it. One of our sages rebuked a woman who had spread gossip. He gave her a pillow and instructed her to take it to the top of the highest building in town and shake out its feathers to the four winds. The woman did so. Then the sage said to her, "Now, go and gather up all of those feathers which you have scattered." The woman cried out that the task was impossible. "Ah," said the sage, "how much easier, though, than gathering up the tails you have spread. Easier to cause a mountain to skip like a lamb than to retrieve an evil story once it has passed the guard of our lips." Hendon is a village. It exists within a city, certainly one of the greatest in the world. It has links to this city. People travel to and fro between them. But it is a village. In Hendon, people know one another's business. In Hendon, a woman cannot walk from one end of the high street to the other without encountering someone she knows, perhaps stopping for a chat between butcher, baker, grocer. In Hendon, only frozen vegetables and washing powder are bought in supermarkets. All other produce is purchased at small shops, in which the shopkeepers know their customers by name, remember their favourite items, and put them by. Though there is a wider world, in Hendon all that is needful has been provided. Torah true schools and kosher shops and synagogues and mikvahs and businesses which are closed on the Sabbath, and matchmakers and burial societies. We learned how to do this a long time ago, when there was no other way. We do it well. Like the turtle, we carry our home with us. We believe that we may soon have to depart for other shores. It is as well to be self-sufficient. On Sunday, the first day of the month of Cheshavan, the moon revealed the tiniest glimpse of her pale flesh, and the week of mourning for Rav Krushka came to an end. Across northwest London, the event registered only a little. The Jewish Chronicle carried a half-page obituary recording the events of the man's life. Its tone was slightly over-enthusiastic, its detail a little hazy. The Jewish Tribune, a publication more certain in its convictions, printed a glowing and fulsome account of the Rav's achievements, accompanied by a large photograph taken in his late middle age. The Rav's death, they said, was like a hammer blow, crushing the heart of Anglo Jewry. His loss left a void that could never be filled. The Rav had been a giant in his generation, the Tribune concluded, who was without doubt already supping at the table of the righteous in the world to come. It is not given to us, who dwell on earth, and not in heaven, to know whether this statement was more accurate than the Chronicle's more modest assertion that the Rav had left no children. In Hendon, the end of the mourning week passed almost without note for members of other synagogues and congregations. The death had been felt a little among the congregants of the Stiebels, those small hidden synagogues formed in hollowed-out houses or unused offices. The Ravs of these communities touched on the life and deeds of the dead man in their sermons. They had known him in boyhood or as a young man. He'd been a leader, a teacher, a friend. Their congregations listened solemnly, but by the time they'd eaten a good lunch, sung the Sabbath melodies and slept a righteous sleep, their regret was largely forgotten. The worshippers at the larger synagogues, housed in suburban cul-de-sacs, cushioned by well-appointed detached properties and swaddled in the certainty that God prefers the comfortably off, read the Chronicle and shrugged or sighed or turned the page. And the young men and women of the alternative services, held in draughty halls, bound together by earnest debate and accompanied by a monthly vegetarian dinner? It would be too far to say that they rejoiced. Let us say instead that, insofar as they were aware of the Rav, they felt only a slight sense of relief at the removal of an element which was neither liberal nor modern, and therefore was without merit.
But in the Rov's own community, the loss had cut more deeply. There had been in those houses over the mourning week a troubling sense of distortion and inexplicability. The arrival of the first day of Keshavan brought with it a certain easing of pressure. The mourning week was over. The Rov was dead. This fact contained not even a grain of mercy. But now a new thought occurred. He had, after all, been an old man. That he should pass was only natural. Once the people allowed this thought to dwell within their minds, they saw that they had always known it to be so. This occurrence was no tragedy. It was not even a surprise. And a little freer, the members of Rov Krushka's congregation began to talk. It began in Levine, the butcher's, the morning of that first day of Kushavan. The shop was crowded and a little too warm. Mr. Levine, son of old Mr. Levine, was serving behind the counter, portioning out mince meat and chopped liver, shouting for his son, young Levine, to bring through more chicken thighs. Mrs. Levine sat behind the till, writing receipts into a carbon book with a firm pencil hand. It was in Levine's that Mrs. Bloom spotted Mrs. Conn, bending over the refrigerator to retrieve a package of sliced tongue. Mrs. Bloom and Mrs. Conn had been customers of Levine since the days when old Mr. Levine still sold cheap, not yet koshered chickens which had to be salted and drained at home. Now his son had introduced lamb chops, marinated in sticky orange fluid for the barbecue, and the chicken schnitzels were called low-fat skinless chicken breasts. Nonetheless, the calf's foot jelly remained garlicky and good, the meatball gravy paste thick. To speak with each other in Levine, the butcher's, was easy, a simple thing which could do no harm. The two women's conversation proceeded smoothly from inquiries about family and friends to the Rav, and from there to his poor family, who must now be suffering so terribly, and from there, of course, to the matter of the woman who had sat next to Esti in synagogue the previous morning. There they stopped for a moment, neither wanting to voice her thought. But emboldened by the shop's noise, they continued. Could it possibly have been her? Neither of them had liked to approach and ask because she seemed so different, and with the Rav's death. But can it have been her? She'd cut her hair, of course, and was thinner and somehow harder looking, but it could scarcely be anyone else, really. What had she been doing all this time? Perhaps she'd been living in Manchester with her family. No. There had been that slit in her skirt. Unless standards in Manchester had fallen dramatically, and the women did not entirely discount this possibility, it seemed unlikely. So had it been her? The Rav's daughter? The one who... Well, there had been rumours at the time of an argument with her father, of some rift. It was impossible to know. The conversation drifted into silence, and, left thus without relief, the women went on their way. They had, however, been overheard by Mrs. Stone, wife of Stone the orthodontist, who had been unintentionally concealed behind the large poultry freezers. Mr. and Mrs. Stone the orthodontist had attended the Rav synagogue for only 2 years. Newcomer as she was, Mrs. Stone had not recognized the surprisingly modern young woman seated next to Esti Cooperman in shul. However, as it happened, that Shabbat had been her turn to assist Fruma Hartog in setting out Kiddush. The biscuits, crisps, fish balls, chopped herring, pickles, and small glasses of sweet red wine provided after the service. Mrs. Stone had noted that Fruma, never the most amiable of co-caterers, had been positively monosyllabic. Mrs. Stone, a woman who took pleasure in allowing her mouth to open, if only to reveal her flawless, even teeth, was not to be dissuaded. As they arranged the crackers in concentric circles on doily-covered plates and ensured that each gefilte fish was pierced by a single cocktail stick, she made another attempt. So, Fruma, did you have guests last night? Fruma's hand shook, the tray of tiny wine cups clattering nervously. She thinned her lips and replied, Esti and David Cooperman. Not that it's any of your business. Mrs. Stone had closed her lips over her teeth, reflecting that perhaps Fruma might be more inclined to smile if her crooked right canine was straightened. Now, however, standing before the poultry freezer, she began to wonder whether Fruma's mood had been entirely related to orthodontic concerns.
Mrs. Stone communicated her suspicions to her friends Mrs. Abraham and Mrs. Burdicher when she happened to encounter them later that morning in the bakery, purchasing soft, warm onion platzels and aromatic granary loaves. The clean smell of bread engulfed them as they stood to one side, allowing others to elbow their way towards the counter. Mrs. Stone tried to keep her voice low, but among the demands for 2 loaves of rye sliced thin, or 2 dozen bridge rolls, the large ones, not the small, she was forced to declare her troubling thoughts loudly. The women nodded as she spoke. The return of the Rav's daughter, the mysterious anger of Fruma Hartog, her failure to mention Ronit as one of the guests at her Shabbat table, it all seemed to have some significance. But what? Mrs. Burdicher drew breath. She might know something, just a little piece of news. The bread slicer clattered, its comb blades flickering up and down as the women drew closer. What? What did Mrs. Burdicher know? Mrs. Burdicher shook her head. It would not be right to speak of such things. She and Mr. Burdicher thought they had seen something on their walk home from Shabbat the previous evening, but they could not be sure. It had been dark. They had been far away. Their eyes might have deceived them, although seeing Ronit so different, her hair so short, her demeanour so assertive, and still unmarried at 32, well, there seemed a kind of sense to it. But what? What had been seen? The bread slicer roared into life again, a limp-haired assistant by its side feeding it 4 large square white loaves. Mrs. Burdicher demurred. It would certainly be Lashon Hara to speak the words, and Lashon Hara is a thing of evil, as they had learned many years before. Mrs. Stone and Mrs. Abraham heard, as though from far away, a faint and calming voice telling them to desist. Move on, it said, go on with your shopping. Buy bagels and kitchels and rogalak. But nearer at hand, they felt a quickening pulse at their temples. Go on, they pressed, go on. Mrs. Burdicher hesitated, and in a low voice went on. The shameful suspicion unrolled, binding them together silently and firmly. Each looked at the other two to ensure that they had fully understood the significance of the remarks. They looked around. The clamour of the customers demanding half-pounds of cheesecakes and savoury rolls continued unabated. None of the 3 wanted to speak first and perhaps reveal themselves ignorant or naive. "It can't be true, surely," said Mrs. Abraham at last. Mrs. Burdicher, despite the nagging of that quiet voice reminding her patiently that she could not be sure, declared that she was. Absolutely. Ronit had always been wayward even as a girl. There had been rumours about her even then. Mrs. Abraham could surely confirm. Mrs. Abraham nodded thoughtfully. "What is the halachic status of that actually?" she asked. There was a moment of silence. "It must be forbidden, surely," says Mrs. Burdicher. The women nodded. "It's not in the Torah," Mrs. Abraham says. "It only says about men lying with other men." "I think it was forbidden by the rabbis," said Mrs. Stone. "It's called the practices of Egyptian women. I think it's in the Gemara." Then Mrs. Abraham, who perhaps of the 3 had heard the small and tranquil voice most clearly, said, "What if it is forbidden?" "In Der Roshel, your brother-in-law's children eat treif meat and don't keep Shabbos. You still invite them to visit you? How is it different?" Mrs. Burdicher looked at first ashamed and then angry. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then, decisive, opened it. "This is a completely different thing. You know it is. Especially forcing yourself on someone like that." "And you're sure that's what you saw?" asked Mrs. Abraham. There was another momentary pause. The bread-slicing machine hummed. "Yes," said Mrs. Burdicher, "I told you. Ronit was holding her. She had to struggle to break free. She'd been crying, I could tell." She adjusted her hat to ensure that no stray locks had fallen into view. The shop assistant, feeding the last of 3 black bread loaves into the bread slicer, felt its teeth brush her fingers and pull back, stung and frightened. A red bead welled from the tip of her middle finger. Mrs. Abraham spoke. "If this is true, we must act. Esty may be in danger. We must do something." The three women blinked simultaneously. This story, which only moments ago had seemed so full of innocent interest, had now become filled with difficulty. Action was called for. But what? In another time, one of them might have consulted the Rav with this dilemma, but to whom were they now to turn? "One of us should speak to David," said Mrs. Berdicher. There was another silence. "Or to Esty?" asked Mrs. Stone. The other two women shook their heads. It was understood that Esty Cooperman could not be spoken to in such a way, or about such matters. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Abraham, "perhaps I could ask Pinchas his opinion. That would not be Lashon Hara, surely, to ask my husband for his view." The women nodded and smiled. A marvellous solution. Pinchas Abraham had completed 2 years' study at a men's seminary and learned Torah 5 times a week. He would know the answer. Given that this conversation had concluded in such a righteous and honourable manner, it can scarcely be considered the fault of these three women if, by the time Mrs. Abraham managed to speak to her husband, seeds of their suspicions had already been swept up by the winds and begun to fall to earth across Hendon. For a baker's shop on a Sunday morning is scarcely the place to conduct a discussion which one wishes to remain private. It must be conceded that as various half-thoughts and barely expressed changes in attitude started to seep from one person to another, several men and women did indeed turn their faces away, saying, "No, this is Lashon Hara." And such people deserve our admiration and our respect. For to obey the words of the Lord when every desire within us urges a different course is difficult beyond measure. The rewards due to such souls are surely bountiful indeed. But most of the people of Hendon did not possess such strength within their souls. Like Miriam, the sister of Moses, they bore tales, or like Aharon, the brother of Moses, they listened to them. And it is not given to us to know in the days when the Tzara leprosy, like all forms of prophecy, had passed from the earth, what punishment the Lord had ordained for them. Whatever it might be, they nonetheless ensured by the time Pinchas Abraham had discussed the matter with his friends Horovitch and Mensch, for despite the opinions of some of our sages, the dangers of Lashon Hara are not confined to women. The matter had already become known, or at least suspected, in several houses around Hendon. And by the time Mensch, who learned Gemara with David, had decided to telephone the house in Manchester, the tongues had done their work. And this work, as we have seen, can never be undone. For no particularly obvious reason, there are seagulls in Hendon. I mean, there's no particular reason there shouldn't be either. It's near enough to the coast. And yet it's incongruous. Walking down Brent Street past the kosher shops and the Talmud Trove bookshop to see seagulls whirling in the sky overhead, swooping down to pick up a piece of discarded bagel, their wings so wide, grey and white, and their beaks so unexpectedly large and vicious. I was surprised to find, on my walk through Hendon on Saturday night, that they were still about even after midnight, swooping and circling. I didn't go back to Esther's house until very late that Saturday night. She was already in bed, the house was dark, and that seemed all for the best. I sat in my bedroom and considered my options. I could go home now, get the hell out of this increasingly creepy, claustrophobic environment, utterly fail to interact with the difficulties of my old friend and lover Esty and her ineffectual husband. And, let's state it for the record, that option certainly had some attraction. But it also seemed kind of an overreaction. I could talk to David, talk to Esty, sit down and have the three of us work it through. I am, after all, to some extent, an American now. That's the good old American therapeutic way. Does it make me a coward that I felt I couldn't possibly, that I didn't want to have that conversation with either of them? So where did that leave me? Oh yes, when in Britain, do as the British do. Stiff upper lip, repression, muttering quietly under my breath and carrying on, sticking it out. In other words, ignoring the issue. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and went to sleep. That night I dreamed of the seagulls of Hendon, of the extreme sharpness of their beaks and the flexing of their claws, of the way they set their heads on one side and look at you with one unfathomable beady eye.
It was a Tippi Hedren sort of a dream, of running away from flocks of seagulls, except that these birds weren't doing anything, not attacking or coming down the chimney or cracking glass. They were just looking. I woke up promptly, pulled on my clothes, and without stopping to talk to Esty or even see if she was awake, I walked straight over to my father's house. I had a mission. If I could complete it, I could be on my way and feel that it hadn't been a completely wasted trip. I pulled open the front door. The house held no fear for me now, not since I'd learned the trick with the radio. I surveyed my work so far. The table in the centre of the study was clear, as was the floor. I'd thrown out 5 black plastic bags full of rubbish and stacked any papers that looked useful along one of the side tables. I spent another couple of hours going through the cupboards, magazines, 30 years' worth of back issues of various Jewish papers. A couple of things that made me feel I was on the right track. In a little velvet-lined box, I found a small silver Kiddush cup I remember using when I was a child. Crammed into the corner of a shelf, trapped behind a pile of Yiddish books, was a glass bowl my mother used to serve pickles in on Friday nights. It was triangular-shaped, spiky on the outside, but somehow curved inside, with a pattern of red and yellow flowers decaled on the side. It was so redolent of that time in my life that, holding it, tracing my fingers over the smooth inner surface, I could almost smell the vinegary dill scent, taste the clean, sharp combination of pickled cucumbers and roast chicken. Thinking this made me angry. What right had my father to hide my childhood from me in this way? This mess, this confusion, felt as though it had been contrived on purpose to keep me from finding what I wanted. I stood up and surveyed the room. The candlesticks weren't here. I had been through every cupboard and every shelf. I suppose I could check behind the bookcases, but that felt ridiculous. No. I held an image of the candlesticks firmly in my mind. I saw them, as my mother used to use them, and later I used to light them every Friday night. I saw their beautiful intricacy, each one as long as my forearm, gleaming silver, with a wide clawfoot base, a slender stem which swelled into a large bulb covered in silver leaves, then on up to a smaller, similar bulb, and then another, before ending with the candle holder itself, large enough to take a candle which would burn for 24 hours if that was required. In my mind, I felt them in my hands. I felt the slight roughness on one of the leaves of the candlestick, which always sat on the right. He would not have given them away. No one else in the family had a claim to them. They must be here somewhere. He would have put them somewhere safe, not on display. They were precious, family things. They belonged upstairs. I walked upstairs. I couldn't think why I hadn't done so earlier. There was nothing here to be afraid of. It wasn't as if he would still be living here or waiting for me in the empty bedrooms. The thought sent a slight uncanny shudder through me, as if by ascending the stairs I might slip away the years and find myself back there, in those same conversations, in that same place. But no, he wasn't here. In my father's bedroom, large cardboard boxes filled with, at a cursory glance, manuscripts and old newspaper cuttings were piled on the bed and the floor. A few yellowed pages had fallen to the floor, articles dating from the 1960s on kosher food labelling and the endless debate over the Eruv. The wardrobe had been plundered at some point. The doors were standing open, and some of the clothes were gone, probably removed to the neat drawers I'd seen downstairs. The chest of drawers was also partly open, a tie hanging over the edge of one of the drawers like a lolling blue tongue. It looked as if this room had been ransacked for clothes in a hurry, perhaps when my father was first taken to hospital and never straightened out. The spare room was far more ordered. I guess David must have slept here, as he did when he was young, if my father needed him in the night. The single bed was made, spread with a blue knitted coverlet I recognised, made by my father's mother years before. 3 or 4 books were neatly stacked on the desk. I pulled open the top drawer and found 2 pads of A4 paper and several pencils, all sharpened, all pointing the same way. David. The second drawer, for some reason, contained nothing but a large can of plums, the label old and peeling. Out of the window I could see the hydrangea bush by the fence, But I didn't look at it. I sat on the bed, stroking the soft woolen cover and thinking. It occurred to me that I could spend the night here, if I liked. It was my childhood home, after all. The house still belonged to the synagogue, but the furnishings and so on were surely mine if I wanted them, and they could hardly begrudge me a few nights' stay in my father's house. Yes, that might solve the Esty and Dovid problem very nicely. I could even stay in my old room. I walked across the hall and pushed open the door. I suppose I was, in a small part of my mind, hoping that my old bedroom would have been kept as a shrine to me, everything exactly as it was the day I left. There might have been evidence of some private grieving ritual, a hockey stick clearly polished lovingly once a week, a large photograph decked at both sides with vases of dying roses. Of course there was none of this, but some aspects of the room had remained the same. My school photograph was still on the wall, my netball medal, dating from the brief period after I was made team captain, but before I was demoted for making one of the other girls cry, pinned up slightly askew beneath it. But these things were only barely visible above the boxes, suitcases, and black dustbin bags piled in a great disorderly mound across the room. The accumulation reached to just above my waist and stretched across the entire floor space. A very small area just inside the doorway was clear, to allow the door to open, but other than that, there was no space large enough for a person to enter. I reached into one of the nearest bags and came up with a pair of men's shoes, one of the soles flapping open at the toe, and a light blue mug missing its handle. The shoes smelt slightly. After a while, I began to wonder whether the smell was coming from somewhere else in the room. Perhaps underneath all the bags and boxes and cases and holdalls there was a mouse or rat's nest. Listening, I thought I could hear a faint rustling. I can't say how long I stood looking. I wondered what Dr. Feingold would make of it. Something irritatingly accurate, no doubt. A way to forget I ever existed, perhaps. An expression of anger. An attempt to fill the void of loss. A pathological determination never to throw anything away. Only my father could have told me, and, well, he's not around to be asked any more. Looking at that room, two things became quite clear to me. The first was that I couldn't stay the night in this house. Not in Dovid's room, not at all. And the second was that I was going to cry. Real, proper, huge, gut-wrenching, cheek-rolling, superfluous, unanswerable tears. I half ran to the bathroom as though I were going to vomit, not cry, sat on the closed lid of the toilet and cried, without being in any way able to explain to myself why. I looked up at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, tear-stained and red-eyed, and remembered something, just something, a moment like this, a time like this. Looking at myself in this mirror, crying, I knew what I was remembering. And the doorbell rang. I sat quite still. Perhaps they'd go away. The doorbell rang again, twice, in quick succession. Then, through the letterbox, came a woman's voice. "Hello? Ronit? Are you there? It's me, Hinda Roshel." Another brisk push on the doorbell, and hiccuping, I walked down the stairs to answer the door. Hinda Roshel Berditcher was indeed standing on the doorstep, with two other women I vaguely seemed to recognise, one blonde and tall, the other shorter and darker. Hinda Roshel beamed. She said, "You remember Devora and Nekamatova?" I frowned. "Devora Lipsitz?" The blonde woman smiled. "And Nekamatova?" I squinted. "I'm sorry, I just can't." The shorter woman smiled too. "Nekamatova Weinberg. I used to be Nekamatova Benstock. I was in the year below you." Three matrons of the town paying a call. Women who had all, naturally, changed their names. "We saw the lights on," Hinda Roshel said. "We thought we'd come and say hello." And I thought, saw the lights on? All three of you? Wandering down the road together in the middle of the afternoon just to see whose lights were on? I couldn't quite piece it together. It was stupid of me, really. I thought, how odd, how strange. How I have forgotten that Hendon really is a village, instead of thinking what I should have thought, that someone had been watching the house and knew when I was there and when I wasn't. They came in, the three wise women of Hendon came in, sat in the lounge, made themselves a cup of tea.
They knew better than I where the tea bags were kept and which were the milky teacups. Hinda Roshel explained they'd often been here to help the Rav. May he rest in peace through his illness. I told her that was very kind of her, and she smiled and told me they were only performing mitzvah. They were impressed by the job I'd done in tidying the house. I explained I was looking for one or two family things to take home with me, and they nodded sympathetically. After the tea was made, the room descended into silence. I looked at them. They beamed at me. I never could leave a silence alone. I said, "So, what are you all doing nowadays?" And they told me in their own terms. Nikamatova told me about her husband and her 4 children, and Devora told me about her husband and their 5 children. I detected a note of quiet pride in her voice at this. Hinda Roshel works a couple of mornings a week as Dr. Hartog's assistant and only had 2 children, but she didn't seem downhearted. She smiled at me, her lipstick mouth peeling back to leave a slight film of red on her teeth, and said, "What about you, Ronit? Are you married?" She said it as though she already knew the answer. I looked back at her and said, "No, no, I'm not." There was a pause as the 3 women took that fact in. Nekhamatova let out a little sigh. There was no doubt that in the eyes of these women it was late, far, far too late for me now. It was not simply that I would never marry, but that, through never marrying, I would never become an adult, would never grow into myself, would remain like the aged grape on the vine, withered without ever having been plucked. Marriage, in this community, isn't just a religious act or a legal binding. It isn't even a thing you do because you like someone and want to be with them. It's a rite of passage, from childhood to adulthood. Those who never do it never grow up. To say that I had never married was tantamount to saying that I had never become a full human being. Nekhamatova wrinkled her brow and said, "Oh, I'm sorry." Devora smiled sympathetically, for all the world as if this, and not the loss of my father, were the real bereavement. And I looked at her, sweet, quiet Devora, who had always been so good at maths and had even, good Lord, taken A-levels, well, 1 A-level at least, and I said, "What do you do, Devora?" She blinked at me. She said, "Just what I told you." "Tisvi and I have 5 children." I said, "You mean you don't work?" She blinked again, twisted her mouth. "I raised the children. But you were always so good in school, so academic. What happened?" This was a nasty thing to do. She didn't really deserve it, except insofar as they all do. She began to stumble over her words. "Well, I always intended that Tzvi and I have always said that maybe when the children are grown—" Hinda Roshel broke in. "Why? What do you do, Ronit?" She did not, I have to say, sound convinced that any answer I could provide would be satisfactory. Still, I told them what I did. It gave me a certain satisfaction. I live in New York, I own my apartment, I'm a financial analyst. I have a right to be proud. Devora gave a little start when I mentioned the name of my firm. Her husband's company does a lot of business with them, it transpired. I explained some of the enormous transactions I'd worked on, household names even in Orthodox Jewish households. Their eyes went wide. They were silent when I'd finished. At last Hinda Roshel cocked her head to one side and said, with all the appearance of concern, "But does it make you happy, Ronit? Does it make you fulfilled?" I looked at her levelly and said, "Hinda Roshel, you used to come top of the class in science. Does changing nappies and making lunch for toddlers really make you happy and fulfilled?" They left soon after that. In the evening I waited in the house as the day grew dark outside. I kept the radio on, did the crossword in the paper, wondered how long it would be until Esty went to bed. I knew I couldn't do this forever, but maybe just today and tomorrow, maybe just that would be enough. And then, because I was lonely, I think, or just tired, or far away from people I knew, I went into the hall and picked up the phone, the same phone we'd always had, cream, Bakelite with a rotary dial. I put the phone to my ear and listened to the buzz of the dial tone, and before I'd really considered why, I was dialing a number. Far away, very, very far away, I made a sleek black telephone on a pale wood desk ring. "Hello?" "Scott? Is that you?"
Run it? There was a smile in his voice, as though he were genuinely pleased to hear from me. How are things in jolly old England? Oh, yes, this again. It's a thing that ceases to rankle after you spend much time in the US, but which can suddenly begin to irritate again. Old, but not jolly, I said. Uh-huh, he said, and I thought I could hear the sound of pages turning in the background. And how's the family? Weird. Listen, Scott, can I talk to you seriously for a second? He paused. He said, Yeah, sure, just a moment. The sound from 3,500 miles away of him putting the phone down on his desk, crossing the office, closing the door and walking back. I felt as though I could hear the distance in the wires. The sound of Scott walking in New York, echoing across all those thousands of miles of thin electrical cable. Ridiculous. Okay, shoot. Do you remember I told you about Esty, that girl I was at school with? Another smile in the voice. Sure do. You guys were an item at school, huh? And then you both went your separate ways. Yeah, except... Well, it looks like she didn't go anywhere. She's still here. She's got married to my cousin. Scott laughed. I hadn't been expecting that. I hadn't realized it was funny. Married? Hey, well, I guess that happens. Maybe you put her off girls, my dear. No, I said, it turns out not. Last night she made a pass at me. Scott laughed again, and I wanted to say, No, don't laugh. It's not funny at all. There's nothing about this that is funny. You going to take her up on it? No, I said, that's not what I... Hey, well, up to you, I guess. And I thought of saying a whole bunch of things about this place, about how the thin, sticky strands of it get all over you, encircle and engulf, about the horror and the desperation of living a narrow little life here, of how I could feel that life start to close around my neck again. But instead I just told him I had to go, but I'd call soon, and not to forget that the McKinnon analysis still had to be completed. And I put the phone down, and I sat in the empty house and waited. Chapter 8. Rejoice and make joyful this precious couple, as you brought joy to your creations in the Garden of Eden before the beginning. From the Sheva Brachot, sung at a wedding banquet. The more we examine marriage, the more absurd it seems. Marriage is only permitted between those who have little in common. One may not marry a close relative. One may not marry a person of the same sex. God, who created the heaven and the earth, might easily have ordained that a brother and sister could marry, that two women together could produce offspring. He could have so ordered the world that those who were the closest were able to mate, and thus he might have given his creations more comfort. Why, therefore, did he not do so? To answer this question, we must first understand that this world exists to teach us. It is to be enjoyed, true, but also to be studied and pored over, as is the Torah, which is also the world. Just as every tiny stroke that goes to form a letter in the Torah contains an infinity of meaning, just so does every aspect of creation. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing has been left to chance. All has been foreseen, and all has been intended. What then does marriage teach us? It teaches us to strive for closeness, that intimacy cannot be attained or retained without effort. And what is the spiritual analogue of this earthly manifestation? It is the burning of the Spirit for its source and His burning for us. Those who believe that marriage is an end in itself, that it is a guarantee of contentment, are fools. Marriage is difficult. It is painful. And it was meant to be so. For in trying to approach more closely to a human being who is so different from us, we begin to understand the task before us in approaching the Almighty. This is our work upon the earth, and the work of marriage prepares us for it. And although marriage may, in slow and unexpected ways, bring us much joy and satisfaction, nothing of the sort has been promised. We may abandon this truth, but if so, we shall have to abandon everything.
We may declare that marriage stands for nothing but the desire in the hearts and the minds and the loins of two people. We may insist that our Creator could not have intended us to live in discomfort. We may, if we desire, stand atop a low mound of earth and declare ourselves lords of creation. But we should not then be surprised if we cease to burn with desire for the source of the world, and if we cease to feel the warmth of his yearning for us. Dovid spent 6 nights and 5 days in Manchester. At the end of those days he returned home to pass the Sabbath with his wife, and in the midst of those days there was a telephone call. It was not an easy visit. His mother was more distressed by her brother's death than Dovid had anticipated from their measured telephone conversations. She was restless, tearful, and agitated over small details, a rescheduled appointment, an unexpected caller. His father, uncertain of how to respond to his wife, retreated frequently to his surgery, claiming an urgent need to deal with paperwork. On Monday night they ate dinner with Dovid's brother Benjamin and his new wife. Nina was already pregnant and looked tired and grey, despite declaring that she felt wonderful. They both seemed oddly deferential towards Dovid, with fixed smiles and inquiries after his health. Dovid wondered if they still thought that he might be the next Rav of the community. Surely not. That night, Dovid and his mother sat alone in the living room. She began to cry after Benjamin and Nina left. Dr. Cooperman left the room immediately, muttering about his backlog of work, the likelihood of several emergency appointments in the morning. Dovid sat with his mother, watching her cry, wishing that he had felt able to retreat like his father. He passed her tissues, and she patted his hand, thanking him and apologizing. He wished she would not apologize. After a few minutes her tears ceased. She dabbed at her eyes with a fresh tissue and drank a few sips of water. She gave a flat-lipped smile. "They seem happy, Benjamin and Nina." Dovid nodded. "I wouldn't have thought it at one time. It took them long enough to decide on each other, but now they seem so happy." Dovid nodded once more. "She's expecting in February, you know. They've been married only a year, and already a baby on the way." These are simple little statements, thought Dovid. Surely they are only gentle words to bring comfort to the lips. "I don't suppose," his mother broke off. "Not here. Not here. Let her not speak these words, not now. Let there be silence." She leaned forward and said to him, "Dovid, are you happy?" "What?" "With Esty. Are you and Esty happy?" "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry, I'm very tired now. I really would like to go to bed." Dovid knew that some people in the community considered him stupid. Even though he'd completed his time at yeshiva and become a rabbi, he was not the spiritual heir who could have eased this rough and unsettling time for them. Even while studying at yeshiva, he had not been a brilliant Torah scholar. He did not have the quickness of mind of the great ones, the easy grasp of new material, or the ability to hold each step of a complex argument in a separate vessel of his mind, combining and reordering them at will. The knowledge that he gained had been hewn each day from solid rock, and had crumbled into sand and stones if not constantly revisited and reshaped. There was a slowness to his manner which sometimes gave the impression that he had not fully followed a line of conversation or understood what was being asked. And it was for another reason, too, that the people considered him foolish, a reason not connected to his lack of rabbinical stature. Dovid was aware, bitterly so, that there were those who had noted his public demeanour with Esty and hers with him. They had taken notice of her uncanny stillness, of the strength of her silence. Esty was not well liked among the women of the community. She did not participate in their lives of chatter and busyness. He knew that 1 or 2 members of the synagogue had gone so far as to ask the Rav, quietly but insistently, if it might not be best if Esty were to leave. They had questioned whether she was a suitable wife for one as near to being the Rav's successor as Dovid. The Rav, who had understood that not every relationship is easy and that ease is not necessarily to be prized above all, had told him of these opinions, so that he might be prepared. Dovid had not passed this news to Esti. He had not attempted to change his behaviour or to influence her to alter hers. His demeanour with her had remained as it had always been, and he had borne the glances, the knowing looks and whispered comments in the synagogue or on the street. It is a terrible, wretched thing to love someone whom you know cannot love you. There are things that are more dreadful. There are many human pains more grievous, and yet it remains both terrible and wretched. Like so many things, it is insoluble. The remainder of the visit passed a little more easily. His mother appeared to regain a certain amount of calm. On Wednesday, Dovid's elder brother Reuven brought 2 of his children to visit, the 2-year-old boy and 4-year-old girl. Dovid's mother drew them into the kitchen and showed them how to make chocolate drop faces on the tops of fairy cakes. "Do you remember?" she said, as she brought in the tray. "Do you remember how you 2 used to enjoy this? Dovid, do you remember how you used to eat the cakes from the bottom so you could save the faces for last?" His mother's face became anxious, as though she were concerned that he might have mislaid something of vital importance, or perhaps concerned that she'd only invented this thought, that he would challenge her over its authenticity. Dovid remembered. They passed a happy afternoon. On Thursday, Dr. Hartog telephoned from London to update Dovid on the plans, he said. The plans? For the Hesped, naturally. Hartog was proud of the progress of his plans. Several learned and widely respected rabbis would be attending the memorial service. Also some significant figures in Jewish life in Britain. Not those who were the best known, the well-recognised faces, but those like Hartog himself, who provided the money, who purchased the influence, whose backing was all-important. Hartog had reserved a place of honour in the schedule of speakers for Dovid. "You will speak, Dovid," he said. Dovid was silent. "It will please the community," Hartog continued, "for you to speak some personal words about the Rav, to discuss him as he was, as a man. He was a father to us all, but to you, above any." Dovid remained silent. "I have prepared some thoughts for you, Dovid, for you to look over when you return. Just some suggestions." "I will consider the matter," said Dovid. When Dovid was 18, he began his rabbinical studies in Israel. The week before his departure, the Rav had requested that he visit him in London. Dovid thought the Rav was going to give him a blessing for his trip or for his study. Every word of blessing spoken has power, but the Almighty hearkens in particular to the blessings of the wise and holy. He imagined that the Rav would place his hands upon his head and ask the Lord to make his study deep and fruitful. It was only right. The Rav, the community, hoped that they would one day benefit from Dovid's learning. And indeed, the Rav had certain words of blessing for Dovid. But once they were seated, alone and quiet in his study, the books around them softly inhaling and exhaling musty, mildewed breaths, the Rav spoke of another matter. "We should speak," he said, "of your marriage." Dovid blinked and tried not to smirk. This conversation was surely a little early. Girls could be married at 17, but a boy should wait at least until he was 20. Why were they discussing this now? The Rav paused to observe Dovid's reaction and continued in a dry and measured tone. "It will be more difficult to find a wife for you, Dovid, than it is for most. It is not enough that your wife be kind, modest, and observant, although these things are important. She must be, sympathetic. We must find you someone who will understand your gift, who will allow you to have time and quiet. No one too noisy, not one of these chatterers. Someone—" The Rav sighed a little. "Someone who sees to the heart of things. Someone who hears the voice of Hashem in the world. Someone capable of silence." He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, then looked up at Dovid. "Dovid, you need not worry. It is not time yet. I simply wanted you to know that your parents and I have discussed the matter, that they are happy for me to locate a suitable girl. Perhaps we will have 1 or 2 for you to meet when you come home for Pesach. Perhaps not.
It may take a little time, but we shall know her when we find her." The Rav clasped one of Dovid's hands between his and squeezed it. Dovid had left this interview feeling both reassured and unsettled. He had the sensation that currents of air were moving far above his head. Now they merely ruffled his hair and kissed his forehead, but one day they would sweep him up and bear him lightly but firmly to a new and mysterious shore. He wondered who the Rav would introduce him to and on what basis he would make his choice. Although the Rav had said they would know her, how would he, Dovid, know? On Friday morning, in his parents' house in Manchester, Dovid received a telephone call from Mensch, with whom he learned Gomorrah on Tuesdays and Thursdays. At first Mensch spoke hesitantly, then, as though gaining confidence from the utterances of his own lips, he proceeded with greater speed and ease. Dovid listened in silence. Once or twice Mensch grew concerned at the quiet and said, "Hello?" Panic rising in his voice, Dovid said, "I'm here," and continued to listen, saying nothing. Mensch spoke of things he had heard, the things that had been told to him. "The people," he said, "the people are saying," and Dovid thought, "Our words will swallow us. We have spat them out, but in the end they will drown us." As Mensch continued explaining what might be said in future, what could be said of him if he did not speak, the fluency he had developed became verbosity. Dovid, listening, had the sense that Mensch was no longer in control of his words. He began to feel that it would be a positive service to the man to call a halt. Without waiting for Mensch to finish a sentence or pause, Dovid said, "Thank you." Mensch stopped speaking altogether. Dovid could see that he'd been correct. The words had taken Mensch over, and he was clearly glad to be rid of them. "Thank you," Dovid said again. "It was good of you to call. But don't you want to—" Evidently the words had not utterly loosened their grip. "I understand why you called," said Dovid. "Thank you for your kind intentions. Well, I must go now, I'm afraid. Goodbye. Yakov." Dovid replaced the handset. He sat down on the small, upholstered bench in the hallway of his parents' house. He stood up again. He ran his hand down the spine of the telephone handset, almost picking it up before withdrawing his hand completely. He stood, hands in pockets, and examined the pictures on the walls, the same ones that had hung there when he and his brothers were boys. A photograph of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, a painting of a man blowing the shofar, his parents' ketubah decorated with pomegranates, wheat sheaves, and fat-bodied bees. The pictures, he noted, were covered in a fine film of dust. He supposed that his mother no longer had the energy or possibly the inclination to dust pictures. It was time to leave. He had promised his wife he would return to London for Shabbat, and Friday does not tarry for any man. His mother prepared him several packages of sandwiches, pieces of fruit in paper bags, little cardboard boxes of juice. His father clasped Dovid's shoulder and thanked him for coming, as though Dovid thought he had been a doctor paying a house call or an unexpected and distinguished visitor. He felt a sudden sadness hanging like a stone pendant within his throat, the cold, smooth mass preventing him from speaking. He swallowed 2 or 3 times, kissed his mother, wished his parents a good Shabbat, and left. As it fell out, he had known, just as the Rav had said. It had been in one of his holidays from yeshiva, after Ronit had left, just after. During that time that Esti had seemed most vulnerable and most alone. It was at the end of a week which he had spent bathed in a constant film of light, rose-coloured headache, sharp points of iridescence at the corners. Esti had attended the house as though she expected Ronit to return at any moment, as though if she waited she might find her still in her old bedroom, as though Ronit had not explained to them with all excitement that she would not return, that she never would. Esti had been waiting. She had the look of someone who might wait forever. And Dovid had simply looked at her one day and known. It had not been utterly simple, for no true knowledge is ever reached without pain. At the instant of knowledge, his rose-coloured headache had put forth a bloom from his mouth, and he had run, retching, to the toilet basin. But in that moment of viscous certainty, he had known as the Rav had told him he would. Unwilling to trust, he had sent her away,
But when she returned the next day, he still knew, more strongly even than he had done the previous day. And the knowledge brought with it its own sadnesses and burdens, but it was not to be denied. And when his parents and the Rav had told him that it was not yet time, that he must return to yeshiva, he had held the knowledge within him, a pool of deep water, its surface untroubled by the tempests that raged without. As Dovid pondered on these things, he felt an ache in his heart for his wife, an eagerness to see her. It was like a sudden craving for a food he had not eaten since he was a child, a flicker of taste in his mouth, reminding him of a sensation he had long forgotten. He felt with brief clarity that she was there beside him, and the next moment could not bear that she was not. He turned the nose of his car towards London and began his journey. Over the years, I've had a lot of conversations with Dr. Feingold about silence. Generally, they'll go something like this. She'll say that I'm concealing something, that I should be honest with myself, and there's something I'm not saying. And I'll say, well, I'm English. It's difficult for me to talk about anything except the weather. And she'll say, I don't buy that. And I'll say, maybe I'm just repressed. And she'll say, yes, you are. The way to become less repressed is to talk to me. And I'll say, but silence. You see? Silence. When in doubt, silence. To most things, silence is the answer. And she'll say, no, it's not. Silence is not power, it's not strength. Silence is the means by which the weak remain weak and the strong remain strong. Silence is a method of oppression. Well, I guess she has to say that. She'd be out of a job if everyone in New York suddenly decided that silence was the answer. In New York, life, my life, is full of noise. If I open the window, I can hear the chatter of the people, the growl of traffic below. Wherever I go shopping in Gristides or Duane Reade, riding the subway, even standing in an elevator, there'll be music or someone trying to sell me something. I like to leave the TV babbling to itself while I'm eating or getting dressed or reading. I'm just not used to silence anymore, which is perhaps why I found the few days Dovid was away so weird. I went back to Esty and Dovid's house. I slept there every night. And after the first night, I plucked up courage to go back when I thought Esty might still be awake. But she wouldn't talk to me. More than that, she wouldn't be in the same room as me, or for preference on the same floor. If I came downstairs, she'd wait until I'd gone into the living room or the kitchen, and then scurry upstairs to hide in her bedroom. If I went upstairs, she'd race back down again. Once, I trapped her in the entrance hall. I waited in the living room until I heard her emerge from the kitchen, and the creaky floorboard in the hall squeaked, and then I sprang out. I said, Esty, don't you think we should... She stared at me for maybe a couple of seconds, and I thought, hey, we're going to manage a conversation. And she ran into the little bathroom just off the hall. She stayed there for 48 minutes. I timed it. When she finally did re-emerge, she made straight for the kitchen and locked herself in. I thought of walking up to the door and shouting, you know, Esty, this is neither a healthy nor a mature way of dealing with rejection. Have you considered getting professional help? I didn't. I spent the next week at the house, arriving early in the mornings and not returning until the evenings. I couldn't go into my old bedroom. I just couldn't make myself. But I went through the things in my father's bedroom and the boxes in Dovid's room. I wasn't sure what to do with my discoveries. Was there an organisation out there that might be interested in a huge archive of Judaism-related newspaper articles dating from the 1940s to the late 1990s? How about the old clothes, the paperbacks, the kitchenware, so old it might actually now be retro chic? I accumulated another small pile of items I might want, a few books, some more photographs, but I still hadn't found the candlesticks. When I returned in the evenings, Esty had left food for me in the kitchen. I thought of asking her not to do so, telling her I could fend for myself, but I knew that leaving such a note would upset her, and actually discussing the matter was clearly impossible. In any case, the food was good, and I was grateful. So every evening I helped myself to a bowl of whatever had been left out in the kitchen, glad at least to be in a place where the indications of life continued, however faintly. And on Thursday night, the night before Dovid arrived back from Manchester, we had a visitor. As usual, Esty had eaten before I arrived back and was in her bedroom. I'd taken a plate of spaghetti bolognese to the living room and was eating it while flicking through the newspaper. mourning the lack of television to make solitary meals less oppressive. I could hear the sound of the newspaper turning, my fork picking up the food, my chewing and swallowing. On the mantelpiece, a large and ornate clock ticked loudly, a gift from the Sarah Rivka Hartog School to Miss Bloomfield on the occasion of her marriage, the plaque read. Each tick seemed like a word uttered into the quiet of the house, a spoken thing created and then dropped to fall back into the ocean of silence. I wondered, looking at the clock, whether all this silence might not be having a bad effect on me. The doorbell rang, shrill and shocking. I stayed where I was. It wasn't my house, after all. A few seconds passed, and I couldn't hear any movement from upstairs. Maybe Esty was afraid that I'd try to get it, and she'd also try to get it, and we might actually encounter one another and have to speak. The bell rang again. I felt suddenly irritated with Esty. Clearly I wasn't going to be having visitors, particularly unexpected ones at 9 p.m. on a Thursday. So either it was some friend of hers or David's, or a man visiting every house with a mezuzah to collect for some Jewish charity, and in any case, it was really her responsibility. There were 3 sharp taps on the door, as though the caller was unconvinced by the bell. Still, no noise from upstairs. I put down my paper and went to answer the door. Hartog was standing on the doorstep. He was smartly dressed, navy blue pinstripe, burgundy tie, a black leather folder in his hand. He looked as though he were about to attend a board meeting. He said, "Good evening, Miss Krushka. I hope this isn't too late to call." I realised that I was standing at the door in a pair of jogging bottoms and a T-shirt reading "Loud Woman" with a tomato sauce stain down the front. I said, No, it's fine. Come in." He nodded, walked into the living room, surveyed the different seating options, chose the least frayed armchair and sat down, crossing one well-tailored trouser leg over the other. He placed the black leather folder on the coffee table next to him and allowed his hand to rest on it, relaxed. As though he owned the place, I thought. As though it belonged to him. He paused. I waited. We looked at each other for a strained, silent moment. "Is there something I can do for you, Hartog?" Hartog leaned back into the armchair and stretched his neck, swivelling his head from side to side. He took his time. He said, "We were surprised to see you last week, you know." He raised his eyebrows a little. "I hope we didn't make you feel unwelcome. David hadn't mentioned to us that you were here, although, of course, David—" He left the sentence unfinished, making a sweeping gesture with his arm as he did so, as if inviting me to take in all that I saw around me and understand that this went to answer the question of David. I sat down, folding my arms. Damned if I was going to stand around like his secretary. I said, "No, Hartog, you can rest assured that I enjoyed myself very much. I can't remember, in fact, having enjoyed a Friday night dinner quite so much as that." Hartog narrowed his eyes slightly and pursed his lips. He seemed about to say something and then thought better of it. He gripped the black folder. He said, "Well then, to business." "Business?" He reached over, placed the folder on his knee and opened it. Inside, the contents were meticulously ordered, documents in clear plastic folders with labelled tabs identifying each one. It was a slim file, perhaps only 30 or 40 pieces of paper in it. I tried to read the top one upside down, but he tipped it away from me so that all I saw was deed. "There are a number of purely administrative matters which we ought to clear up, pursuant to your father's death," he said, flicking through the folder. "I hope it is not too distressing for you to discuss at this time?" I shook my head. "Well, then," Hartog gently pulled out the first of his collection of documents and handed it to me. It was the deed to my father's house. "If you will direct your attention to page 5, he said, his tone measured, professional. "You will notice that the registered owner of the house is the synagogue board." I nodded. Hartog looked at me as though expecting more of a reaction. Perhaps he'd thought this news would come as a shock. I wasn't shocked. My father had explained it to me years ago. The synagogue owns the house. The Rav lives in it. Perfectly normal practice. What were they going to do, accuse me of trespassing on their property? I studied the deed for a few moments and handed it back to Hartog. "Presumably you'll be removing the house contents before the new Rav is chosen then," I said. Hartog looked at me. "You needn't worry," I continued. "There are only a few things I want. I'll be finished soon." Hartog smiled. "I'm glad you raised that matter, Miss Krushka." He replaced the deed in his folder and began flipping again as he spoke. "The contents of the house, of course, belonged to the Rav. His collection of Talmudic books, largely donated by friends from across the world, was particularly fine, but you know this." I nodded. Hartog smiled again and removed a second sheet from his file, placing it on the table in front of me with the air of a poker player revealing a winning hand. "This is the Rav's will, properly signed and witnessed, as you can see. He leaves the contents of the house, all the contents, to the synagogue." He looked at me. "Now, Miss Krushka, I understand that you've been visiting your late father's house and are intending to remove some items." I thought of Hinda Rochelle Berditcher, who works for Hartog and whose lipstick always seems to stain her teeth red. I thought of the friendly visit on Sunday. "I must tell you," Hartog continued, still smiling faintly, "that as a representative of the synagogue, not to mention—" he looked down, "a great admirer of your late father, I would consider it a dereliction of my duty were I to allow you to remove synagogal property from his residence. I'm afraid that I cannot permit it." He looked at me. The clock kindly presented by the Sarah Rivka Hartog Memorial Day School ticked. The silence between us grew and resounded until I could almost hear it, a slow and steady heartbeat of silence. "What do you want, Hartog?" He wrinkled his brow. "What do I want, Miss Krushka? Nothing more than to do my duty as an elected officer of the synagogue. Bullshit, I wanted to say. Bull-fucking shit." I dug my nails into the arm of the chair. I waited. He'd have to come out with it, whatever it was. Hartog rearranged one or two pages in his folder. His hands were steady. I thought about what a wealthy man Hartog is. Does wealth do this for you? Does being wealthy give a person this capability to say anything to another human being, never to feel even slightly concerned that you might one day need their assistance? Hartog, apparently satisfied with the order of his documents, looked back up at me. "There is one other matter we should discuss, though," he said. "As you know, we are arranging a hesped for the end of the month of mourning, 2 weeks away, in fact. Many distinguished rabbanim will be joining us from across the world. Your father was a well-respected, much-loved man." I nodded. I'd already heard some of the plans from Dovid. "We, that is, the synagogue board and I, very much want this hesped to be a fitting memorial to your father, to his religious and spiritual legacy. We want to avoid unnecessary difficulties, do you see? We would like the event to run smoothly." He looked at me levelly, as though trying to assess whether I'd followed him so far. I looked back. I had an idea of what was coming next. I wasn't going to say it for him. "We would prefer it, the synagogue board would prefer it, if you did not attend the hesped." He paused. "In exchange, we are prepared to allow you to remove whatever personal items, reminders of your father and so on, you wish from the house." Hartog looked back up at me. His face was calm, showing no hint of worry or agitation. I wondered how long he'd been planning this speech. "So, let me just be sure I've understood you," I said. "You don't want me to go to my own father's memorial service, and you're bribing me not to by offering to give me some things which are mine by right anyway." "I wouldn't like to use the word bribe, Miss Krushka. I think we can both agree that for the good of the community—" I was angry now. "What? What is supposed to happen to the community if I attend the hesped?" "Well," he said, spreading his arms wide again, smiling that faint, supercilious smile. "We don't need to go into that, do we? There have been certain rumours, Miss Krushka, certain pieces of information which you yourself do not deny. Of course, the synagogue board does not listen to Lashon Hara, but as you have admitted the matter yourself, well, it would simply be inappropriate. Surely you can see that." "Inappropriate because I told you I was gay?" Hartog's smile disappeared. "No, Miss Krushka. Inappropriate because in the past 4 days, 7 other people have told me so. You're becoming somewhat notorious. We wish the hesped to be a quiet and joyful celebration of the Rav's life, not," he paused, "a circus of freaks." I became very calm at that. I began to think what a profoundly punchable face Hartog has. How his nose sits in the middle, so round, so like a target. I almost laughed. I said, "You know, you can't make this go away by making me go away. I'll be gone in a few weeks anyway, but it's not me, Hartog. I'm not your problem." "Really?" said Hartog. "It is strange, then, that this problem seems to have arrived just as you did. I would call that a coincidence. Would you not, Miss Krushka?" We looked at each other. I thought of telling him everything then, to explain to him how his perfect little world could never be perfect, that they weren't going to be able to make unsettling things go away by closing their eyes and believing they weren't there. I thought of telling him that it had never been perfect here at all, not even a little bit, and I had the evidence to prove it. But honestly, he wouldn't have understood. He wouldn't, and Hinda Rochelle wouldn't, and the members of the synagogue board wouldn't. Like Dr. Feingold says, you can only save yourself. I said, "And you don't think it's inappropriate to hold a memorial service without the Rav's family?" Hartog waved an arm. "David will be there, of course, and the Rav's sister, possibly his brother, will fly over from Jerusalem. The family will be represented. You need not concern yourself with that." My right hand involuntarily curled into a fist. "So, what is it exactly that you want me to do?" Hartog leaned back in his chair. He stretched his neck again, moving his head slowly from side to side. "We would like you to leave quietly, just before the hesped. There's no need to make it dramatic. You could simply say that some matters have come up at work requiring your attention. You will have to rearrange your travel plans, of course. We understand that this may incur some expenses, which we are quite willing to reimburse, as well as compensating you for your trouble." He turned to the back of his folder and produced a check, which he held between his thumb and forefinger. "As you'll see, we feel we're being more than generous." He passed me the check. I looked at it. £20,000. About $33,000. More than enough to cover 20 return flights to New York. I noticed that although Hartog had spoken as we, the check didn't come from the synagogue account. It was from his own personal account, signed in broad, firm strokes, Dr. Hartog. Clearly, Hartog was bankrolling this little scheme himself, however much he wanted to present it as being the will of the community. I turned the check over in my hands. "And you wouldn't like to use the word bribe, Hartog?" Hartog thinned his lips. His face, I noticed, had become more white. "I don't think that would be appropriate, no." "So, what if I refuse? What if I decide to attend the hesped?" Hartog breathed in sharply. "Don't you understand?" he said. "You would be bringing shame on everyone, and for no purpose. No one wants you here. Most of the people barely remember you, and for those who do, you are nothing but an embarrassment. Can you imagine how difficult it is for Esti and Dovid to have you here? To be spoken of in this way, can't you see? They are much respected members of the community. They have a place here, and you," he paused, "you, I'm sure, have a place somewhere else." He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. "Miss Krushka," he said, "run it. I believe that we, the synagogue board, and I, have made you a very generous offer. We are simply protecting our community, your father's legacy. I don't understand, I really don't understand why you want to come here after all this time and attack us. Surely you've made a life for yourself in New York. It seems a more appropriate place for you. We simply want to live in our accustomed way, as I'm sure you do." My first instinct, of course, was to tell Hartog that both he and his check could go to hell. I wasn't going to be dictated to or told where I could and couldn't go, where I was and wasn't wanted. But as I looked at him,
with his punchable face and his smug, supercilious smile. I found myself thinking, no, this is not my fight. Hartog's right about that, at least. I left here a long time ago precisely because of this kind of bullshit. I don't have to deal with it. I could just walk away. Instead of fighting, I could pretend that Hartog and I are both civilized people. I could take the things that I wanted from the house, get on a plane, and go. I could just leave. After all, I've done it before. And, instead of punching Hartog, I found myself saying, "Can you give me a little time to think it over?" Hartog nodded, as though this was the outcome he had anticipated, and closed his folder. I followed Hartog to the door and let him out. He walked briskly away, calm and assured, swinging his black leather folder in one hand. I stood at the door, watching him until he was out of sight. I turned back into the house, and, as I did so, caught a glimpse of movement and heard a sound on the stairs. I looked up and saw Esty, sitting towards the top of the staircase, arms hugged around her knees, watching and listening. Her face was pale, and her eyes were endless black.
This is the end of CD 5. The book continues on CD 6. CD 6.
Chapter 9. Between me and the children of Israel, it is a sign forever that in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested. Exodus 31:17, recited on Friday night at the commencement of the Sabbath. It is ridiculous, of course, to speak of the Lord resting. Are we to believe that the Ein Sof, he who is without end, became tired from his labours, that his muscles were exhausted? We are not children to believe such nonsense. What then does the Torah mean when it tells us that God rested on the 7th day? Our sages explain that it is not that the Lord rested on the 7th day, it is rather that on the 7th day he invented rest. It must be understood that we're not speaking here of sleep or food or time for tired muscles to knit. These are only forms of work. They exist to service work. We sleep, we eat, we relax our limbs and our minds in order that we may be nourished and fit for further work. And if all that we are is work, what are we? We work in order to gain food to swallow or a pillow to press our head into, and we eat and sleep in order to work. We are machines doing nothing more than reproducing ourselves endlessly. But Shabbat shows us that this is not so. Shabbat is not a day of recreation, of pastimes. It is a day of abstention from creativity. It is a day of treading lightly upon the world. We do not use wheeled or motorized transport. We do not spend money. We do not speak on the telephone or use any electrical item. We do not carry outside our houses even an object as small as a handkerchief, even in a pocket. We do not cook, we do not dig, we do not write, we do not weave, we do not sew, we do not draw. As far as possible, the world is not altered by our sojourn in it over Shabbat. Instead, we eat food we have already prepared. We talk, we sleep, we pray, we walk. Simple human things. And by these actions, we resist our impulse to be constantly meddling with the world, altering it, making it conform more closely to our desires, as though our desires were all that mattered. Shabbat is simply to take our hands from the wheel and let it spin. And here we reach the heart of the matter. For if we cannot be distracted by our actions, our creation, we must at last come to ourselves. We, man and woman, were created at the moment before sunset on the 6th day. We should recall that each Friday, at sunset, is the anniversary of our birth. Shabbat draws us back to ourselves. Shabbat presents us with all we have achieved, but nothing more. Shabbat asks quietly but insistently who we are. And Shabbat will not relieve us if we should have no answer. Friday, Esty thought, hums like a frightened insect. It buzzes. Trapped inside the head, it flits from one side to the other, striking the skull, making a noise like a clock ticking. With each tick, it declares, these are the minutes until Shabbat, and now these, and now these. This hum, this ticking, is a light thing, a simple thing, but as demanding and as impossible to disobey as the rhythm of one's own need for breath, or of the times and days of the menstrual cycle. Friday will not go unanswered. Friday may not be postponed. If that which is needful is not accomplished on Friday, no mercy will be shown. For the Sabbath cannot be delayed by even a half a minute from its appointed time, and all who think to halt its arrival commit thereby a grave transgression. Esty rose at just after 6 a.m. The dawn had not yet whispered its morning words into the sky, but as she looked out of the window, she could see a few touches of a lighter and more tremulous blue beginning to caress it in the east. She washed her face briskly at the basin and stared out for a few moments at the insidious fingers of light creeping into the sky. It was Friday, and Friday would not wait. It was Friday, and at every minute from now until sunset she would know what time it was. She checked the printed calendar on the wall. Sabbath would begin at 6:18 p.m. She dressed quickly, gathering up her hair into a loose bun, pulled on a berry and tucked in the loose strands. She had things to do. Like Friday, she could not be detained. She ran through her mental list. There were clothes to be washed and ironed, the food to buy and cook. The room should be cleaned and ordered, the table laid, the time switches set, the urn filled, the hot plate prepared, and was there anything else? Of course, the special errand. How long would it take? It was hard to know. The other thing should be completed first, then she could think further. For the next 8 hours she worked. It was the same work as every week, the same dishes to be prepared, the same food to be bought. There was an order to it, a calming pattern. She found that while she worked she did not worry. At the baker's shop, she picked out 3 large plaited chalot, glossy and warm. At the greengrocer's she chose fresh fruit and vegetables. She passed by a chemist's shop, paused fractionally outside it, contemplating. Mrs. Salman from synagogue passed by on the far side of the street, laden with butcher's bags. Mrs. Salman noticed Esty, smiled, and with some difficulty raised a hand. Well, it could not be done here, then, the special errand. Not in Hendon. Esty walked on from the chemist's. At the butcher's, she selected some raw chicken livers. At home, she koshered them over an open flame, the blood dripping down, the smell distinctive as of singed hair or nails. She made soup, boiling the water in her large stock pot. Drops of condensation formed on the outside of the pot. She held the 3 chicken carcasses up to the light, admiring their tracery of veins and rosy muscle filaments. Their bones moved beneath the clinging remnants of flesh in a fine, articulated motion. She turned them over, considering their elements of life, and, suddenly decisive, dropped them one by one into the boiling water. They rose to the surface, the meat blinking from living pink to white, a sudden sharp aroma of soup causing her to swallow. "And so it goes," she said to the chickens, "and so it goes. From muscle and bone to soup, so it goes. And what are you, after all, but chickens? A life of feathers and squawking. What is that?" She looked at the clock. 10:07 a.m. Towards the end of the morning, David telephoned to say that he was leaving Manchester, that he expected to be home in 4.5 hours. At some point, too, Esty became aware that Ronnet was no longer in the house. Earlier in the week she might have wondered where she'd gone or paused to reflect on her presence. On another day, she might have felt the same stomach-dropping despair, the same caught-breath fear as ever. But today was Friday.
At last, early in the afternoon, Esti finished. The clothing was clean, the Shabbat outfits ironed, the house was in order. In the oven, the chickens were almost roasted, though not quite brown enough. On the stove, the soup was merry, bubbling and wakeful. The tzimmies, the liver, the kugels, the cakes, the gefilte, the potatoes, the vegetables were all as complete as they could be without spoiling. A few small things remained to be done, but they could be completed on her return. Her body spoke to her in a quiet, unrelenting voice. Today. It should be done today. She turned off the oven and the stove, took up her bag, and left for the station. The day was unseasonably warm, and as she walked, she began to sweat, a thin, unpleasant dampness sticking her skin to her clothes. The prickling sensations in her arms and legs were the 1,000 eyes of the people of Hendon. Isn't that Esti Cooperman? Where could she be going in such a hurry, and on a Friday afternoon? There could be only one possible answer to the riddle. Where would a married woman be going at great speed only hours before Shabbat? They would know. They would all know. These were not friendly eyes. She realized that now. She could not trust them to keep her secrets. She could not trust them not to think. Esti tried to breathe slowly, speaking softly to the muscles of her thighs and calves, telling them to be easy. For there could be any number of reasons. No one, she murmured, would ever guess. Her legs would not listen to her. They sped on, faster and faster. At the station she was confronted with the fact, bold and unanswerable, that she did not know where to go. It should be somewhere she would not meet anyone, somewhere no one would look at her and note, Esti Cooperman. But where in London could she be certain of that? She looked at her watch. 3:20 p.m. David would be home very soon. Shabbat was at 6:18 p.m. She did not have time for this uncertainty. The buzzing in her head was louder and more insistent, the knocking sound on the inside of her skull stating more firmly, tick-tock, tick-tock. She ran her eye along the map of the Northern Line. Where could she be certain? Which of these little unfolding buds? There. A point of intersection. Camden Town. She purchased her ticket from the impersonal machine, grateful for its simple questions. Where are you going? How many zones? Not why are you going? Not for what? She counted again as she travelled. The rhythm of the journey was good for counting. She counted first these days, then those, then the extra ones. She counted again, and the total was always the same and always wrong. She leaned her head against the cool glass partition, feeling tired and a little faint. She closed her eyes and listened to the click-clack of the train, so like the tick-tock in her own head. It was only as the doors were about to close that she noticed she had reached Camden Town. She leapt up and bolted through the door. Camden sweated. It was loud. It smelled. Esti stood outside the station, simply looking, her bag clutched tight against her body. A thin young man, whose chest read, "Screw the people," was leaning against the railing, eating a jacket potato from a plastic container. He jabbed up every mouthful with his fork, as though hoping to cause the potato pain. Without warning, he twisted his mouth, glared at his food, and threw it onto the floor. He walked away. The melted butter trickled onto the pavement, its scent rising. A small dog, dragged past by a woman teetering in pink sandals, stopped to lick the paving stones 2 or 3 times. The world spun. Esti wondered if she was about to faint. The shops and people began to merge into a distorted inner-ear judder. Everything became suddenly upside down, inside out, bingle-mingle. Camden would not cease at 6:18 p.m. The streets would not become quiet, the people still. These people had not prepared for the Sabbath. They did not hear the sound of Friday in their skulls. The thought made her weak. A dizzying ache, a breath of compassion. She held on to the railing, breathing deeply. This would not do, she thought. She must restore order. She must continue to breathe. She looked at her watch. 3:53 p.m. 2 hours and 25 minutes left before Shabbat. The thought quieted her a little. Still gripping the railing, she looked about her. She glanced at the faces walking past, each one absorbed in its own confusion. Never to hear Friday, never to know it. It was as though they had never known love, both terrible and wonderful. She had considered them before, the people who did not know Friday. She wondered now if this was how Ronit felt in New York, without lines and demarcations, without order and sense, without anchor. A thing to be both feared and desired. She lifted her head and looked a little further, searching for the right kind of shop. A chemist shop. Her heart pounded in her chest. She tried not to breathe too rapidly. There was one on the opposite side of the road. She hurled herself towards it, racing between the angry cars. Things were cooler in the chemist shop, clearer. The people moved more slowly, spoke more quietly. Although she was surrounded by aisles of products, they remained in their lines and orders. There were small labels by which they could be identified. She felt calmed by the sense that all this had been intended. She began to search. She walked along each aisle, turning her head to the right and to the left. As she walked, she counted. She'd been counting for 2 days now, adding and subtracting, figuring and refiguring. But perhaps she'd been mistaken. How foolish she would feel, how absurd, if all this time she'd simply counted incorrectly. She counted again. The numbers remained the same, mute and unanswerable. She walked on, past shampoos and conditioners, creams to remove hair and sprays to replace it, deodorants and perfumes, vitamins and minerals. She found the thing she was seeking just past the array of contraceptive products. The two sitting next to each other like an exhibit demonstrating the law of cause and effect. She turned the packet over in her hand. Fastest, most accurate results, it proclaimed. Recommended by doctors, and used from the first day your period is due. She counted the days again. The days of bleeding and the days of counting after bleeding. The day of mikvah, the days between mikvah, and when Ronit arrived, the days since then. 29 days. And tomorrow it would be 30. She had felt none of the signs, had experienced no pain. She knew it would not begin tomorrow. She held the thing in her hand and looked up and down the aisle to see if she was being watched. An elderly man with yellowed eyes was examining the toothbrushes, holding them to the light in turns, squinting as if to detect some esoteric flaw. Nearer to her, a young black woman, her hair braided into cornrows dotted at the ends with coloured beads, was standing before the moisturizers. Both her arms were red and scaly, wrist to elbow. It looked painful. Esty felt another wave of fatigue break over her, veined pink and roiling. Her eyes defocused, and for a moment there were 2 women in front of her, not one, each of their cornrows swaying slightly. Esty leaned heavily against a shelf, but dislodged 2 or 3 boxes which clattered to the floor. The young woman looked at her and moved away. Esty clutched the thing in her hand, looked at it again. Results in 1 minute, it said. She looked at her watch. 4:25 p.m. Friday muttered and growled. Less than 2 hours to go. Tick-tock, tick-tock. No time for this nonsense. There was a short queue at the checkout. The elderly man in front of her had laid out 7 toothbrushes and was asking for the price of each one before he made his final selection. Behind her, an Indian woman, plump midriff deliciously exposed, rummaged through her handbag, clucking and sighing. She smiled at Esty. Esty smiled back. The elderly man decided not to purchase any toothbrush at all and moved away. Esty handed her item to the cashier. The Indian woman, peering over Esty's shoulder, said, "Oh." Esty turned. The woman was beaming. She placed a soft hand on Esty's arm. "It is a blessing from God. You understand? A blessing from God." She pointed upwards, lifting her eyes to emphasize. Esty nodded. In her confusion, she gave too much money to the cashier, 3 5-pound notes. Some had to be handed back. She tried to move away, but the woman plucked at her sleeve. "Remember," she said, "from God." The time of the commencement of the Sabbath is known to the Almighty more precisely than any clock can declare it. In his infinite mind, if we may be permitted to speak of the contents of his mind, the 6th day becomes the 7th without fuss, without effort. The border between one and the next perfectly clear. The minds of man, however, do not admit of such ecstasies of understanding. For the Sabbath was created by the Lord. It is an object of the divine, but a man is simply a man. And thus our sages, whose interest was ever in translating the divine to a human tongue, instituted the 18 minutes. For although the Sabbath begins precisely at the moment of sunset, the printed Sabbath times in calendars or newspapers in fact allow a margin of 18 minutes before the setting of the sun. This knowledge is not to be used lightly. It is infinitely preferable and meritorious to commence the Sabbath at the printed time, and thus to avoid all doubt. But if one finds oneself without resource, the margin still remains. 18 minutes of grace before the start of the holy day. By the time Esty arrived home, only 34 minutes remained before the start of Shabbat. The small package in a handbag spoke of its reliable results available in only 1 minute. But the soup muttered coldly, with round syllables of fat on its surface, and the chickens, knowing their own incompleteness, ruffled non-existent feathers, demanding a perfect brown to replace their own. Dovid and Ronit had both returned, but Esty could not consider that now. She worked, warming the soup, roasting the chickens, glazing the potatoes, seasoning the cholent, icing the cake. Friday marked off the moments more and more clearly. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Slow and steady, neither aggrieved nor impatient, but inexorable as the tide. Tick-tock, tick-tock. At 3 minutes before the printed time of Shabbat, the final items had been prepared. She switched off the oven and the hob, tucked a strand of hair back into her hat, and looked about her with satisfaction. 2 full meals were cooked, chickens and potatoes, glistening rice, cholent deliciously bubbling in its slow cooker, vegetables steamed, cakes baked and decorated, soup magnificently rich, fish clad in carrot scales. Dovid had left for synagogue. She heard the door slam behind him. Her candles were set out in the dining room. It was time to light. Was there anything she'd forgotten? She swept her eyes across the kitchen, the dining room, the hallway. In the hall, in a handbag, a small voice squeaked. Test at any time of day. Accuracy guaranteed. Tick, said Friday. Tock. It was time to light her candles. Shabbat was coming. Tick. Esty ran upstairs to the bathroom, the package concealed in her sleeve. She looked at her watch. The 18 minutes had begun. Locking the door, she examined the packaging again. 1 minute for a reliable result. There was time. She pulled open the packet. Tock. The instructions were more confusing than she'd anticipated. It took several minutes to read and comprehend them fully. The tip of the plastic stick should be immersed for 5 seconds only. She must time it, counting off the seconds, allowing no errors. She tore at the inner plastic wrapping. Tick. She waited for the colour to change. Surely this was the necessary emergency, the thing which cannot be postponed until after the Sabbath day. She looked at her watch. 13 minutes slid over to 14. She must leave time to light her candles. The moisture crept up, fibre by fibre, taking its own time. Was it even permissible to look at the thing after the Sabbath had begun? Surely it must be forbidden even to touch it. A device that changes colour, an object with no purpose on the Sabbath. How long could she wait? Tock. She looked out of the bathroom window. A certain ripeness had fallen over the blue of the sky. The leaves of the apple trees, the red-tiled roofs, the parked cars, the roads all exhaled, saying, "We are done. For this week our work is completed." They settled into the earth, allowing themselves to sag. Esty looked at her watch. 16 minutes. She looked at the sky. The blue was even more profound. The Sabbath was beginning. She looked back at the window in the small plastic wand, and she found a blue line held in that small space. And that line was a boundary between one state and another. And that blue spoke to her of other beginnings and changes of an even more perfect order. Dr. Feingold says the subconscious knows no past or future. For the subconscious, everything is happening right now. Trauma that happened when you were 4 still feels exactly as threatening now as it did then. Trauma that happened when I was 4, I say, like the death of my mother. Yes, she says, for example. Do you want to talk about that? I tell her that her ideas about the subconscious remind me of God. She says, God? In the Torah, Moses asks God to tell him his name, and God gives him a word, YHVH. No vowels, so it can't be pronounced, even if you wanted to. It's an impossible conjugation, 3 separate tenses of the verb to be smashed together in one word. It means having been, going on being, and going to be in the future altogether. From this, we learn the timeless nature of God. The past, the present, and the future are all the same to him. Dr. Feingold listens to this silently. When I'm finished, she leaves a space of another few seconds. She says, "There's a difference, though. The subconscious is wrong about the past and future. Things which were threatening in the past aren't so scary anymore. That's different from your idea about God, isn't it?" I say, yes. If my idea about God is correct, then the subconscious is quite right. The past hasn't gone anywhere. It's right here. On Sunday, I went back to my father's house, just to check. The locks had been changed. I tried one key, then another, jiggling each one, pulling the door towards me, pushing it away. I stood holding the whole useless bunch, flicking at the peeling red paint by the hinges with the toe of my shoe, as though that's what I'd intended to do all along. I walked to the side of the house, pushed open the rotten gate and walked through into the garden. The overgrown lawn had yellowed in the heat. One of the apple trees was bent double, its branches scraping along the weed-ridden flower beds, and by the fence was the hydrangea bush. I picked my way along the path and bent over to examine it. A few flowers were still hanging on, petals beginning to curl up and brown. I crushed one between my finger and thumb. I remember only in fragments the bare legs, the hydrangeas, the taste of her mouth. There was a place between the hydrangea bush and the fence where 2 girls could crawl if they were little enough and not afraid to scratch their knees. It was one of those places that seems obvious to children, hidden to adults, a secret place. In winter it was nothing, the bush was bare, but every summer the little room bloomed again. Now there was nothing. The bush had become overgrown, the ground was too wet to crawl on. I couldn't have sat underneath there, even if I'd wanted to, plus I was much bigger than I'd been back then. I knelt for a long time, though, my palms resting on the damp earth, my fingernails sinking into it. When I got up, finally, and started the walk back to Esty and Dovid's house, I tried to scrape the lines of dirt out from under my nails. The harder I scraped, the deeper I pushed them in, black ingrained against red. We'd known about the hydrangea bush for years. Once we were inside, we were unseen, screened from the house, from the eyes around and above. It smelled, I remember, the thick smell of rotting hydrangeas and damp old earth. Even now, the vegetable scent of hydrangeas holds power. In springtime, passing by hydrangea-filled buckets at Grand Central Station will flicker into a sudden sharp memory of dirt underneath my fingernails and 2 warm, maroon-coloured sweaters and the bare whiteness of the tops of her legs when she'd taken off her tights. It was a school rule we had to wear thick, dark, opaque tights so that no man could see our legs and become aroused. Because, of course, in the minds of the teachers at the Sarah Rivka Hartog Memorial Day School, no man would ever become aroused by a schoolgirl in tights. After school, Esty would come back to my house to do homework. So I suppose that's where it started. With the heat of summer, with Esty and me racing to my bedroom, wrestling our tights off and standing bare-legged and triumphant. To begin with, we just enjoyed sitting where no one could see us. No one being my father, who wouldn't have been looking, and the housekeeper, who'd generally gone home by then anyway. To begin with, we just sat, talking or reading or staring up at the sky through the geometric flowers. But it was there that things started. Like the thing with the blood. We'd learnt it in school, studying ancient customs and geography. Miss Cohen explained it, sniffing and curling her lip to make us understand that this was something primitive and disgusting. But I listened, and I didn't think it was disgusting. It felt like I was remembering something I'd always known or heard long ago. Esty had cut her knee. That was the next thing. She was always cutting something. She could barely make it through a games lesson or walk across the playground without tripping. The heels of her hands and her knees were constantly dotted with little scabs, fresh, half-healed and old. This cut on her knee was more than the usual skid scrape. She'd fallen on broken glass, left at the corner of the sports field, and had needed 5 stitches. All the girls talked about it afterwards, mentioning the 5 stitches with glee, imagining the needle passing in and out of flesh for each one. The wound was long and curved, with puckered stitches. It looked like her knee was smiling with crooked teeth. Even after the stitches, if you pulled at the edges, you could still make it bleed. Fresh, new blood, running in red, viscous lines down her shin. Anyway, that's how it happened. We were sitting behind the hydrangea bush, Esty with her knees pulled up tightly to her chest, me sprawled on my back, staring at the leaf roof above us, panting in the heat. Our shirts were rolled up above our elbows, tights off, skirts pushed back. Such careless exposure of flesh. If we'd dressed that way at school, we would have been punished for immodest behaviour. Esty craned her neck to examine the smiling scar on her knee. I had a little scab on the palm of my hand, about the size of a halfpence piece. I peeled the brown cover off my hand and watched with satisfaction as a bead of red rose to the surface. I said, "We should become blood sisters." She looked at me. "You remember? From geography? We mingle our bloods and then we're sisters forever." She shifted uncomfortably, bringing her knees tightly into her chest. "Will it hurt?" "Only a little bit, but we just had to open your cut. See? I'm bleeding on my hand. We have to let them mix. Come on." She stretched her leg towards me. I pulled on the cut at the edge until it seeped water and then blood. Her legs were cool, despite the warmth of the day. When I looked at her face, I saw that she was biting her lower lip, eyes ready to overflow. "Don't cry," I said. "You're such a baby." I squeezed the graze on my hand, scratching it with my nail until the blood was flowing more freely. I looked carefully to see where the hole was, then clasped my hand to her knee, matching up the places, blood to blood. I looked at Esty. She looked at me. An insect thrummed in my ear. A small breeze disturbed the leaves above us. Somewhere, a few gardens along, someone was mowing the lawn. I realised that I was sweating, just at my hairline. On Esty's leg, a crust of blood, like watery jam, had congealed around the edges of my palm. I said, "There. Now we're sisters." I took my hand away. Esty looked at her knee, still bleeding, and my palm rosy with her blood. She took my hand, examined it for a moment, and put it back in place on her knee, blood to blood. She held my hand firmly there on her leg, her palm cold against my knuckles. "What you have to understand," I say to Dr. Feingold, "is that it was our place. We found it. We sat there from the leaf buddings of spring until the autumn destroyed it again. We never mentioned it to anyone else or invited anyone else in." She says, So, you felt betrayed? Did I? It's plausible, but that's not how I remember it. I remember feeling angry. On Monday, I made the telephone call. I told myself it meant absolutely nothing. I checked with them that, yes, the ticket could be cancelled up to 24 hours in advance. 100% refund, yes. And as I gave them my credit card details, I concentrated on the thought that it was just a precaution. I'd never use it. But I chose the times of the flight with care, as though I was thinking of getting on that plane. That evening at supper, Estie's hand crept over to Dovid's. Her fingers touched his knuckles lightly. He looked as surprised as I was, both of us flicking our eyes down and then up again. But her hand stayed where it was, her head bent down, concentrating on her plate. What really annoys me about Esty is not how inarticulate she is, or how sensitive, or how really, at bottom, conventional. It's the stupidity. It's the fact that she just can't admit who she is, can't look herself in the face. Neither one way nor the other. Even then, she couldn't see what I could see. She didn't know. Maybe she still doesn't bloody know, but I knew. It was the summer. We were 13. The summer of becoming blood sisters. Dovid had headache after headache that summer. He was supposed to go to yeshiva the next year, but he spent days just lying in bed. In the afternoons, when a headache had left him weak, I used to sit by his bed talking to him. And that was how it happened. I introduced them. They'd met before, of course, but never really talked until that summer. I brought Esty up to sit with him, and he told me later that he liked her because she was so quiet and peaceful. I was proud that I'd found him something he liked, as though I'd brought him a toy or a book he'd enjoyed. So we three used to sit talking in his room, most afternoons. If I'm honest, I did most of the talking. I used to think that if I hadn't been there, they probably would have just sat together in silence, so at least I rescued them from that. Dovid got a little better, and a little better. After 3 weeks, he only had a headache every 4 days, and he went back to studying with my father in the mornings and by himself in the afternoons. But somehow he still found time to play or talk with me most afternoons, whenever Esty was around. I didn't really notice that then. Not until the very end of the holidays. The last day of summer holidays always contains a certain fluttery fear of the return to school, of returning to the person you are at school. My father didn't notice. He kept me busy running errands for him all afternoon, returning a book to someone, picking up spare tallets for the shul from someone else. So much so that I was late. Esty was supposed to be coming over to say goodbye to Dovid. He was going back to Manchester. We were going back to school, and we wouldn't see each other until the winter holidays. I remember thinking as I ran home how awful it'd be for the two of them to be there together without me. They wouldn't have anything to say. I ran faster, gym shoes pounding on the pavement, skirts swaying against my calves and ankles, in the way that always made me wish I could just rip it off and run without it. When I arrived back, they weren't in the lounge. Maybe in Dovid's room. I dashed upstairs. Nothing. I looked out of the window. The garden was still, but a little movement stirred the hydrangea bush. I walked downstairs, through the kitchen, and into the garden. I heard laughter coming from the place, and a rustling of leaves. I ducked my head under and crawled through. Dovid and Esty were sitting in the hydrangea nest together, laughing. His legs were stretched out, trousers covered in dust, and he was smiling, a thin laugh escaping from the side of his mouth. She was tightless, legs drawn up, skirt tented over her knees, choking on little high-pitched laughs. As I entered, they both turned towards me, then looked at each other, then smiled back at me. And Esty said, "Oh, Ronit, Dovid just said something so funny." And she stopped, looked back at Dovid, and started to laugh again. It wasn't really as though I wanted either of them. I just expected them to be there when I needed them. I just expected that they'd stay where I put them, wouldn't cause trouble. They were both so obedient. I ran out. Back through the kitchen, into the hallway, out of the house, running and running, and not really looking where I was going because I just needed to keep on moving and moving, which, in retrospect, was dangerous. And I was quite lucky that I didn't run into the road, but instead, just into a tree. I tripped and whacked it with my elbow. The force was strong enough to make me cry out. And when I turned my arm, I saw that I'd ripped a gash in my elbow. Blood was splashing onto the ground. And then there was pain. Esty and Dovid followed me up to the bathroom, hovering on the threshold. Esty said, "Can I do anything? Does it hurt?" Dovid said, "We must call your father on it. This could be serious." I closed the door and locked it, shutting them out. I remember the blood dripping into the basin, startling crimson drops, the swirl of red and pink when I turned on the tap. I remember crying, just a bit, being surprised to find myself crying, looking at myself in the mirror above the basin, seeing my own face crying and not knowing my own reflection. I didn't have stitches. I washed it and put plasters on, gathering it together, and hid it under my sleeve. By the time I came out of the bathroom, Esty was gone, and the next day so was Dovid. The wound healed unevenly, leaving a piece of tree bark lodged in my elbow. I didn't do anything the first day of school, on the second, or the third. I don't know why. It's not as though Esty would have known what I was thinking. Maybe I remembered that God was watching me and I thought I could put him off the scent by leaving a few days between cause and effect. So I left it till the fourth day after Dovid left. I waited until we were sitting after school, warm and drowsy in our secret place, bare-legged and open-necked. "Esty," I said, "I have a new game." She blinked at me. "You have to lie very still, and I have to try to make you laugh, okay?" She rolled away from me, lying on one side. I lay down next to her, not quite touching her, but feeling the heat from her body on my skin. Softly, I stroked the curve of her neck from ear to shoulder, a ticklish place. She didn't move or speak. I ran my hand along her arm, brushing the delicate hairs gently. So far, this was charted territory. She remained perfectly still. I moved in a little closer, my stomach against the small of her back, my knees tucking into hers. I slipped my hand under her shirt, circling my thumb around her navel. And still she lay, inert. I began to wonder if I'd misunderstood. Was she about to leap to her feet, accuse me of terrible things? I shifted a little to look at her face. Her eyes were closed, her lips curved in a smile. Her breath was long and shallow, a flush on her cheeks. She moved a little and opened her eyes, as blue as water. And her skin on her belly and her thigh was so soft, like the skin of a child, as delicious as wine. And as she stirred against me, her lips parted, and she uttered a breath like a sigh. And she turned and placed her lips against mine. The tree of unhappiness, they say, grows from a seed of bitterness and brings forth the fruit of despair. What would have happened if I had never touched her? Might she have gone to Dovid as freely as a bird, knowing no different? If I had not existed, might she have found peace, or would she simply have sown her discontentment elsewhere? If I had not existed, how would she have found Dovid at all? No one can answer these questions. Not even me. Not even her. We didn't know what to do, really, that first time. We leaned on each other's hair, fumbled and blushed. But there, behind the hydrangea bush, slowly, we learned. We went from one thing to another as we wished, as we understood. After the moment when her lips touched mine, when we knew we had transgressed, there was no road to travel back. Everything was already done. I remember the sensation of her cool fingers passing over the tip of my breast, hardening, wrinkling the skin like a whisper of wind. I remember the shock of it, the unmistakable heat. I remember her shiver of delight. I remember learning in school later that human beings are electric animals, flowing with current, and thinking, I know.
I have already learnt this fact of electricity within the skin. I remember only in moments. On Tuesday night, I had a dream. One that I hadn't dreamed for a long time, although it was as familiar as my own skin. I dreamed that I was getting ready for Shabbat, but I was late, much too late. We all have this dream. Perhaps I could suggest it to Dr. Feingold as a subject for a book. The Anxiety Dreams of Orthodox Jews, Ex-Orthodox Jews, and Heretics. I was in an unfamiliar place trying to get home, but I didn't know how, and the sun was setting. I was racing through unfamiliar, dirty streets, looking for a subway or tube station or for a taxi. But all the taxis were full, and there was no station. I had to watch the sun dip lower and lower until it finally disappeared over the horizon. And after that, what is there to lose? I noticed my office and decided to go in. But when I went through the door, it wasn't my office at all. It was Esty and Dovid's house, and they were perched on a kitchen worktop, hand in hand, kissing like schoolgirls. On Wednesday, I went to see Hartog. I showed him my ticket, and he smiled everywhere except for his eyes, and told me what a wise decision I'd made. We went to my father's house that night, and he watched with a supercilious air as I gathered together the clutch of items I'd found. The pictures, the kiddush cup, the spice box, the Seder plate. Under the sink in the kitchen, I found a plastic bag and swept them all in, unwilling to have him look at them. As we were leaving the house, I tried to take the bag, but he shook his head, as though speaking to a small child, and said, "No, no, Ronit. I will accompany you to the airport the day before the Hesped. I will watch you check in your luggage. I will see you go through passport control, and as you do, I will give you this bag. Not before." He shook his head again, chuckling slightly. The urge to punch him in the face welled up in me again. I could see it. His nose bent crooked, blood gushing down his chin, dribbling onto his yellow silk tie. I held on to that image, pure and clear, as he locked the front door behind us, jangling his bunch of keys in my face when he was finished. Dovid and Esty conspired over the washing up that night, as if I had already gone, laughing little meaningful laughs, flicking foam at each other. I sat in the other room trying to read my newspaper, and I thought, I am taking something home with me. I'm not leaving with nothing. So the next morning, Thursday, I did an evil thing. Dovid left early for a meeting of the synagogue board. I remember those meetings. My father used to attend them. 4 hours at least of old men expressing the same point several times very slowly. I had time. Esty had school in the afternoon, but not the morning. She and I were alone in the house, but there was no fear in her. She'd been more relaxed, more whole since Dovid's return. That was best. It would make everything easier. I walked to the shops. I understood my own intentions. I looked for exactly the right item. No near misses would do. I felt the guilt strike my face with heat when I asked for what I wanted, and a voice in my head said, "She's not for you, this one." And I said, "I thought I told you to shut up. I thought I killed you with chocolate cake and prawn sandwiches." And the voice said, "No." And I said, "Fine. Talk all you like, I'm not listening. You're doing wrong." Said nothing, and no one. Oh, what do you know? She's gay. Any fool can see it. She fancies women. If you're so bothered by that, why didn't you make her straight? There are more kinds of belonging than you know, Ronit, to my joy. The world is not so easily categorized as you might prefer, and you are trying to steal that which you do not even desire. Oh, what do you know about desire? That at least is our area, not yours. And what do you mean steal? I found her first. Childish games, my dear one. You are more than this. And I said, I don't have to listen to you anymore. I have learned to disobey. And the voice said other things, but my heart was hardened to them. I crept into the house. I listened. Deep, penetrating silence. I could almost hear the motes of dust in the hallway, softly settling on the dried flower arrangement, the pile of letters, the scuffed shoes lined up against the wall. Where would she be? A noise from the kitchen. A glass being put down. Of course. I turned the door handle. There she was. at the sink, staring into the garden, one arm wrapped around her waist, her hair in a collapsing bun, soft tendrils at her neck. I watched her for a moment. It's funny, but I'd forgotten that she was beautiful. There was a sensuousness to her, a grace in the angle of her jaw and the curve of her breast. I felt it then. I wanted what I'd decided. Well, that's always been my way. I walked over to her. She was absorbed in the view, twisting her hair around her fingers, thinking. I looked at the garden for a few seconds. The day was damp, mist curling through the trees, droplets clinging to the leaves. Esty was warm and slow breathing next to me. I wanted suddenly to embrace her, to circle her waist with my arm, to gather the folds of her dress in my hands, to explore her again, as we used to. I ran my thumb slowly down her spine, from the nape of her neck to the curve of her buttocks. She turned around, not startled or surprised, but smiling. I let my hand rest on her waist, and with the other, offered her my gift. Here, for you. Hydrangeas. Chapter 10. It is a vitally important commandment, always, to be happy. Hasidic saying. How is it possible, always, to be happy? Does not King Solomon tell us that there is a time for weeping and a time for laughter? Should we attend at a house of mourning, show our beaming faces to the bereaved, and declare, "Be happy"? May such behaviour be far from us. What then is the meaning of the commandment to be always happy? To answer this question, it is necessary first to understand the nature of human happiness. Happiness is not the same as comfort. It is not necessarily to be found in ease, in luxury and plenty. Ease, luxury and plenty are not shameful, but they are not happiness. Too much comfort can, in fact, cause weakening of the body, depression of the spirit and despair of the soul. We human beings, like the Lord Almighty who created us, yearn to build. Our happiness, in this world at least, is to be found in creation. And when we are creating, any fleeting pain becomes not only irrelevant, but actually joyful. An example. One who walks by mistake into a birthing room might think at first glance that he'd entered a torture chamber. The room is covered with blood. At the centre, a woman is screaming in agony while attendants look on. The scene is medieval in its cruelty, and yet, were we to ask this woman in the instant at which the pain is most extreme whether she is unhappy, we would be met with incomprehension. She may be worried, exhausted, experiencing physical agony, but unhappy? Absurd. This is the happiest day of her life, because that which she has built, that which she has created in her inmost self, is about to burst forth. Happiness is not a sensation of ease and comfort. Happiness is the deeper satisfaction we find when we create, when we construct a physical object or compose a work of art or raise a child. We experience happiness when we have touched the world and left it different, according to our will. We experience the greatest happiness when we have touched the world and left it better, according to the will of the Almighty. And though the work itself may be on occasion enjoyable, certain works can only be accomplished through struggle. Thus, it is that happiness often resides where we find pain, and the greatest agony often presages the greatest triumph. Red. It had begun as a film of red, a passage of circles surrounding and rebounding. The red was in the circles of his eyes, in the roundness of his head, singing through his ears like a train, around and around, its curve allowing no purchase. It was a vector of destruction, a soft and unfortunate muffling, concealing its true identity. When he woke, it was barely anything. A less experienced man might have disregarded it. He imagined himself as a guide, taking tourists around his head.
"You see this?" he said, indicating the swirling circles of gentle red gathering on the horizon. "Doesn't look like much, does it? But in an hour or two, mark my words, there'll be a raging storm here." The tourist gasped, bewilderment mixing with skepticism, gazed fearfully at the far-off clouds, and walked to shelter. Far away, red gathered. David wondered sometimes if the headaches were always there, at the edges. If, like weather, they never really went away, only became subtler, less demanding. Even while feeling quite well, if he took his thoughts around his head, he could find the shadow of one cooling its heels in his temples or the bridge of his nose. Sometimes, when a headache had shrunk him, so that he could only gaze fixedly at a single tiny object, a smooth stone or the rubber on the end of a pencil, he wondered what it was doing with all the room it had made, whether some secret process was taking place in the fractured other segments of himself. Perhaps it was he himself who did these things. Often at the times of greatest agony, David had the disconcerting feeling that some element of his mind was observing his discomfort, noting it down and commenting. "Yes, this is interesting." "David, what are you doing?" asked Kirschbaum, the secretary, sharply. Kirschbaum was sharp, from the point of his nose to the crisp corners of his shirts and the glinting buttons of his jacket. David's eyes hurt to look at him, but he supposed he could not go on indefinitely staring at the rubber end of his pencil, absorbing its comforting and insightful roundness. He raised his head, allowing a few circles of red to slide down into his neck. The boardroom was panelled in wood and furnished in leather. He rested his gaze on the blonde panels just above Kirschbaum's head and strove to make a remark. He said, "On the morning of the Hesped, David, what are you doing?" David wondered if it was time to lower his head yet. The red circles invaded his eyes, tiny and clustering. They chattered there among themselves, and every time he tried to look at them they moved away, remaining forever at the edge of his vision. He knew this was a very bad sign indeed. He explained the matter to his imaginary brain tourists, gratified by their cowering and shivering. He wondered whether he himself ought to be cowering somewhere. Home, bed, sleep, yes, no. He could not return home. It was vital to be here, to listen to all that was being said, to understand it all. It was vital because something was happening. Something he did not want, something out of his control. Red beads rolled and tumbled inside the dome of his skull, cutting off lines of inquiry. Now, Kirschbaum," said Hartog, "David doesn't need to do anything. Just arrive like any other guest, David. That's best." Hartog sounded concerned. The red circles jostling each other began to tumble out of David's ears onto the table. He wondered why the other board members couldn't see them, but realised that, of course, they vanished once they left his body. It had all begun so much better than this. The morning had been clear, insightful and sharp. It was often that way on red days. The beginning of red, a transparent crystalline pink, manufactured the world in perfect order. The air saluted. A slight hum behind his eyes assured him that all was well. He knew better than to believe it. In bed before rising, he made his calculations. His wife was curled alongside him, the two beds pushed together to make one, although he was sure, certain in fact, that the time for this had passed. Her nightgown was rucked up, swirled between her thighs. He buried his face in her shoulder, inhaling her biscuity fragrance. She stirred, sighed, and settled back into sleep. He put his arm around her waist. Nothing more. The decisive pink made apparent. Nothing more than this was possible, but this itself was something. The beds had been pushed together when he returned from Manchester. A large sheet spread over them, making them one again. He had stood, staring at the beds for several minutes, wondering if he ought to comment or if it would be better to say nothing. He could not remember when they had last slept together in one bed, perhaps their first year of marriage. Yes, it might have been then. He decided to say nothing. She also said nothing. It was, David reflected, best. Words would only have complicated this simple thing. Nonetheless, he found a perilous joy in these moments. There was a sweetness in allowing his hand to brush against her back or shoulder while they lay. On the pink morning, he found that she had rolled near to him in her sleep, that she was curled like a mouse facing him, that her hair touched his arm. She was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body in the nest they had made. He looked into her face and smelled her breath. Its scent was warm bread. It had been a long time. He remembered an incident from their wedding day. He recalled almost nothing of the day itself, only moments. The terrible lurch when he was lifted up on his chair during the dancing, the way his hand had trembled as he placed the ring on her forefinger, and the vast crowds of smiling faces. He remembered her, cool beside him, and he remembered the half hour they'd spent alone together in the midst of all the confusion. It is the law. After the wedding ceremony, the bride and groom must spend a little time together, alone in a room, witnessed as they enter, witnessed as they leave. The room set aside for this purpose at the Rav synagogue was a small windowless antechamber, a storage place for the festival prayer books. They were stacked in cardboard boxes against the walls. A space had been cleared in the centre of the room, and a folding table and 2 chairs set up. Someone had thought to leave some small sandwiches and plastic cups of fruit juice. David remembered that Esty had walked across the threshold of the room first, and that, as he walked in behind her, one of the guardians of the gatepost, an uncle of Esty's in his late 50s with a small moustache, had winked and smiled at him, as though they shared some knowledge, although, he reflected, they shared the very opposite of that. The purpose of this Yikud room is privacy. It is the first creation of that space which lives forever between a husband and a wife, and which only they inhabit. What he shared with Esty's uncle, David supposed, what all married men shared, was the knowledge that the secret space existed, the understanding that each possessed a room whose contents would remain forever hidden. Esty's dress seemed to fill 3/4 of the room. It billowed around the table leg and nudged up against the boxes. Within it, she seemed small and inconsequential, an ornament for the dress. David almost wished she would take it off. He experienced a sharp pang somewhere between joy and pain when he realized that later in the day she would take off her dress, that he would be present, that even this was no longer forbidden. She sat down. He sat down. She looked at him. David had studied for 3 months the laws pertaining to marriage, those governing the contract between husband and wife, and those dealing with more intimate relations. But his knowledge was nothing in the face of this slender woman and the life pulsing through the blue veins in her wrists. David had never before done so much as to hold the hand of a woman. He wondered how he should proceed. It had all seemed so obvious when he had decided on marriage, so simple when she'd agreed. But now, what was to be done? Esty cast her eyes downward at his hand resting on the table. Her own pale hands were in her lap. With the lightest of touches, she ran a single finger along the back of his hand. It was the first time they'd touched. He had not anticipated how soft the pads of her fingers would be. He had never before considered the pads of the fingers of any other human being. He could find no words which seemed appropriate to express this. She took his hand in hers and brought it gently to her face. She held it there, his palm cupping her chin and jaw. He could feel the fine hairs of her cheek, her fingerprints burning into the back of his hand. They sat together like that for a long while. David knew nothing, he realized, of the contents of Esty's mind. He could not hope to discover, let alone understand, what thoughts moved her as she sat holding his hand to her cheek. He was alone, in the smallness of the room, in the space within him. And yet they were both together, alone. He understood as if the knowledge had been waiting for him in this windowless chamber. That was, at bottom, what it amounted to be alone, together. That thought returned to him as he lay in bed, crystalline pink, watching her sleep. Alone. Together. There were 6 members of the synagogue board. There would have been 7 with the Rav. A divine number, as the Rav used to point out, the days of creation. A useful number, as Hartog had it, an odd number with no possibility of a stalemate in voting. In any case, a good number. But now they were 6, and decisions would still have to be reached. They passed easily over the first few items of business, agreeing to repoint the synagogue's brickwork before the winter, raising the membership fee by £50. The debate over the hesped began sedately. Quick agreement on how the tables in the hall should be arranged, a brief discussion about which caterer to appoint. No expense should be spared, this was certain, particularly because so many eminent figures would be attending from around the world. The pink slowly deepened into red. As the colour accumulated drop by drop, Dovid found that the words of the board members began to lose meaning. It was something like listening to a conversation while falling asleep. Some sentences would be perfectly comprehensible, but then he would find that the words had vanished, that he had missed some important point. The discussion gradually began to lose coherence. They were discussing how the honoured guest should best be treated, or was it? No. Now they seemed to be discussing whether wives should sit, or... No. The order of the speakers, how long each should speak for? There, something there. He'd heard his name. He struggled, concentrated, and pushed back the tide of red, splitting it to make a dry path. "Yes?" he said. "Dovid, at what point in the service would you like to speak?" Ragler asked. He was holding a pencil, running it down a list on a sheaf of papers. "We think perhaps the end will be best, a grand finale." Ragler smiled a little too eagerly. Dovid blinked. "Not now," said Hartog. "Let's not frighten Dovid. There's no need for it to be seen as a grand finale, simply a fitting end to the service." Around the table the men nodded. "But I don't," said Dovid. "I don't want to speak. It's not, I'm not... someone else, surely." No, said Kirschbaum. "We are quite convinced. We've discussed the matter at some length. It'll be quite right for you to speak, and perhaps—" He paused, looked at Hartog, who nodded. "Also to take over 1 or 2 of the Rav's other duties, to give the sermon on Shabbat, for example. After the hesped is over, naturally. We wouldn't want to rush things." Dovid looked round the table. Red pulsed at the corners of his eyes, a drumbeat, a military march. There was pain now. It increased steadily, beat by beat. He summoned his strength and stared at the red, congealing it into a single point of blood scarlet above his left eye. He held it there, throbbing and complaining. He was making it worse by refusing. There was no refusing in the end. Concentrate. "You mean," he said, aware that his speech was a little slurred, "you mean until we appoint a new Rav?" The men around the table leaned back and smiled. "Perhaps," said Hartog. And Dovid knew. He grasped all at once Hartog's intentions, those of the board, but the red precluded full understanding. Its force gathered. It was creeping out again, soaking through the interior of his skull, fibre by fibre, invading him. "No," he said. "No, I can't. I'm not." He looked at the men. A swarm of red encircled them. Hartog leaned back in his chair. He spread his arms, broad and expansive. He said, "It is time for this coyness to be over, Dovid." The table turned their heads to Hartog, swift as birds. Red pounded in Dovid's head. Hartog smiled again. "We need you," he said. "The community needs you. You are at the Rav's right hand. You will not obviously be the Rav, but the community needs order, continuity. You will provide it for us. We have, after all, provided your education for this purpose, Dovid." Red had reached its zenith. It was strong, a mighty power, a sea of red held back only by his will. Soon, very soon, it would break through all defences, sweeping over him like a tide of scalding water, defeating him.
He saw the whole thing as if it had already occurred. He saw how it would happen. So simply, so smoothly, inch by inch, he would be given the rough's place. It had already been connived at. He would speak from the rough's book, and from his notes he would speak of the rough. He would give an illusion of unchanging continuity. He would desiccate like an elderly book. He had, as Hartog said, been prepared for this role. He could tolerate it. But Esti... But my wife, was all he managed to say. Yes, said Hartog, we have considered that. We know that you have held back. Your wife, it is difficult. She is not perhaps ideally suited to this role. This place may not be right for her, but we would be happy, Hartog beamed a demonstration of happiness, to enable her to spend much of her time elsewhere. She has family in Israel, yes? It would perhaps be appropriate for her to spend more time there, away from the demands of the synagogue. Red circled and recircled a thought in David's mind. He thought, I will lose her. If you make me do this thing, I will lose her. She will not return, whether you send her away or not. He thought, I may already have lost her. He thought, perhaps that is best. He thought this place kills women. It bleeds them dry. Red took up that thought. It enjoyed it, rolling it back and forth in the tide of his mind. There is no need, of course, for this to be decided now. We have time. All that is needed today is to arrange the hesped. This, at least, is simple. You will speak, David. David strained to think. This was, he realized later, a mistake. There should be no struggle on a red day, not when the strings were so tight, so precise. As he worried at his mind, he felt something strain, then snap. Red broke through, small circles marching in the corners of his eyes, chattering, Not now, not now. Oh, yes, said Red. Now. You will speak, said Hartog. It was not a question. Red overcame him. There could be no more arguing now. Yes, whispered David. Red surged and pounded. It began to trickle out from its bright spot, out across his skull, more powerful than he had known. He found that he was breathing more deeply, more quickly. Red thrummed to the rhythm of his pulse. It was coming, and the only thing left was surrender, to let it be over quickly, smoothly, without fuss. Since childhood, David had kept a certain phrase for moments like this, unbearable moments. He considered it now, turned it over and over. He thought of nothing else, as Red boiled in his skull, bubbling and spitting, preparing to burst forth, raw hot from his ears, his mouth, his nose, his eyes. This is only pain, he thought. All that this is, all that it can possibly be, is pain. It cannot do anything more. Just pain. Only pain. Like a diver casting off into the ocean, he took a breath and went down into red.
This is the end of CD 6. The book continues on CD 7.